Tom and Emily had always dreamed of escaping the bustling city life. After years of saving and searching, they finally found their perfect retreat, a quaint, isolated cottage deep in the countryside, surrounded by thick woods and far from any prying neighbors. The cottage had a rustic charm, with ivy-covered walls, a thatched roof, and a garden that looked as though it hadn't been tended in decades. It was their dream come true, a place to start anew, perhaps even raise a family. The first few days were blissful. They spent their time unpacking, exploring the surrounding woods, and planning renovations to make the cottage truly theirs. The air was crisp, the nights were quiet, and the only sounds they heard were the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. However, as the days turned into weeks, they began to notice things that were off. Emily would often feel as though someone was watching her when she was alone in the house, and Tom swore he heard footsteps on the floor above him when he was certain Emily was outside. They both dismissed these as quirks of adjusting to a new home, convincing themselves it was just their minds playing tricks on them. One evening, after a long day of work on the house, Tom and Emily settled into bed. Just as they were about to drift off to sleep, they heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of a child's laughter, echoing through the darkened halls of the cottage. The laughter was faint at first, almost as if it were coming from outside. Tom sat up, straining to listen. Emily clutched the blankets closer to her chest, her heart pounding in her ears. They exchanged glances, both unsure if the other had heard it too. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Tom nodded, his face pale in the dim light. "It's probably just the wind, or maybe some animal," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. But the laughter came again, louder this time, and definitely from inside the house. Tom jumped out of bed and grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table. "Stay here," he instructed Emily as he crept towards the door, trying to ignore the icy dread settling in his stomach. He moved quietly through the house, checking each room, every corner, but found nothing. The house was empty. As Tom returned to the bedroom, Emily's wide eyes met his. "There's nothing there," he said, trying to sound reassuring, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. They tried to brush it off as exhaustion, maybe even a trick of the wind, and eventually, they both fell into a restless sleep. But the laughter continued in the following nights, growing more frequent and closer, as if the unseen child was moving through the house. Days passed, and the atmosphere in the cottage grew tense. Emily began to feel a presence around her during the day, a cold spot in the room or the sensation of small, invisible fingers tugging at her clothes. She mentioned it to Tom, but he was quick to dismiss it, chalking it up to her imagination. But Emily knew something was wrong. One afternoon, as she was dusting in the living room, she heard a soft giggle right behind her. She spun around, but no one was there. The air around her felt colder, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She stood frozen, her breath hitching in her throat. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice wavering. Silence. Then, slowly, the laughter echoed again, this time from the hallway. Emily followed the sound, her heart racing. The hallway was empty, but as she reached the end of it, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, on the floor, was a small, dusty teddy bear that she had never seen before. It looked old, the fur matted and worn, one button missing. It was placed neatly in the center of the hallway, as if waiting for someone to pick it up. Tom was skeptical when she showed him the bear later that evening. Maybe it was left by the previous owners, he suggested, though he couldn't explain how they had missed it during their initial cleanup. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the bear wasn't just a forgotten toy. It felt like a message, a sign that the child, whoever or whatever it was, wanted to play. As the days wore on, the occurrences became more frequent and more intense. The laughter now echoed through the house at all hours, and the feeling of being watched was almost constant. Emily began finding other toys around the house, small dolls, marbles, a rusty toy car, all of them old and in various states of decay. She knew they hadn't been there before. One night, Emily woke up to the sound of humming. The soft, melodic tune floated through the dark, coming from just outside their bedroom door. She nudged Tom awake, and together they listened, paralyzed with fear. "I can't take this anymore," Emily whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "We need to find out what's happening here." The next morning, they drove into the nearest town and went to the local library, hoping to find some history about the cottage. What they discovered was chilling. Decades ago, a family had lived in the cottage. The parents, desperate for a child, adopted a young boy from a nearby orphanage. The boy, however, was troubled. He would often talk to imaginary friends, claimed to see things that weren't there. The parents grew fearful of him, especially after he started talking about a dark figure that would visit him at night. The boy's behavior became more erratic, and one night, he vanished without a trace. The parents, overcome with guilt and fear, eventually moved away, and the cottage had been vacant for years until Tom and Emily moved in. Armed with this knowledge, Tom and Emily returned to the cottage, determined to cleanse the house of whatever spirit was haunting it. They brought in a priest to bless the home, hoping it would bring them peace. For a few days, things seemed to quiet down, and they began to feel a sense of relief. But it didn't last. One evening, as they were sitting in the living room, the lights began to flicker, and the temperature dropped suddenly. The laughter returned, louder and more sinister than before. The sound of small footsteps echoed through the house, growing closer. Tom grabbed a candle and led Emily to the hallway, where the sound seemed to be coming from. As they stepped into the hallway, they were met with a horrifying sight. The toys that Emily had found were scattered across the floor, forming a path that led to the basement door, which was now slightly ajar. With trembling hands, Tom pushed the door open, revealing the narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. The laughter was deafening now, reverberating off the walls. They descended the stairs, each step feeling like a descent into madness. In the basement, the air was thick and musty. In the center of the room stood a small, shadowy figure, facing away from them. The figure was holding the teddy bear Emily had found earlier, cradling it gently. "Who are you?" Tom demanded, though his voice shook with fear. The figure turned slowly, revealing the pale, gaunt face of a young boy. His eyes were hollow, and his skin was a sickly gray. He smiled at them, a smile that sent chills down their spines. "Play with me," the boy whispered, his voice echoing unnaturally through the room. Tom and Emily backed away, but the boy advanced toward them, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The basement door slammed shut behind them, trapping them in the darkness with the spirit. The last thing they heard before everything went black was the boy's laughter, echoing in their ears like a final, twisted lullaby. When the townspeople noticed that Tom and Emily hadn't been seen in days, they eventually made their way to the cottage. What they found was disturbing. The house was empty, with no sign of the couple. Their belongings were still there, but Tom and Emily had vanished without a trace, just like the boy from so many years ago. As the search for the missing couple continued, rumors began to spread about the haunted cottage. Some said they could still hear the faint laughter of a child when they passed by, while others claimed to see fleeting shadows in the windows. The cottage soon fell into disrepair, abandoned once again, and the story of Tom, Emily, and the lonely child became a local legend, a cautionary tale told to keep curious children away from the cursed property. But the story didn't end there. Years later, a new family moved into the cottage, unaware of its dark history. The cycle began again, strange noises in the night, toys appearing out of nowhere, and that eerie, spine-chilling laughter. The boy was still there, waiting for someone to play with him, forever trapped in the darkness of his lonely, twisted game. Jenny had always loved camping. The serenity of nature, the crackling of a campfire, and the sense of peace that came with being far from civilization were what she cherished most. So, when she and her friends decided to spend a weekend at Red Lake, a remote and little-known spot deep in the woods, she was ecstatic. The lake was rumored to be untouched by modern tourism, a hidden gem surrounded by dense forests, with crystal-clear waters that mirrored the sky. It seemed like the perfect getaway. They set off early on Friday morning, driving for hours through winding, forested roads until they reached the small clearing near the lake. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine filled their lungs as they stepped out of the car. The group, Jenny, her boyfriend Mark, her best friend Sarah, and Sarah's boyfriend David, were all seasoned campers, ready for a weekend of relaxation and adventure. The first day was perfect. They pitched their tents, gathered wood for the fire, and spent the afternoon swimming in the cool, clear waters of Red Lake. As the sun began to set, they settled around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The atmosphere was light, filled with laughter and the occasional teasing. As night fell, the forest around them seemed to come alive with the sounds of nature, the hooting of owls, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the lake. It was peaceful, almost magical. But as the hours passed and the fire began to die down, an uneasy feeling crept over Jenny. She couldn't shake the sense that something was off, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. When she mentioned it to the group, they brushed it off as jitters from being in such an isolated place. Mark playfully teased her about being scared of the dark, and they all laughed it off. But deep down, Jenny knew it wasn't just the darkness that was bothering her. That night, as they crawled into their tents, Jenny found it difficult to sleep. The wind had picked up, and it howled through the trees, making the tent walls flap. She lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Just as she began to drift off, she heard it, a soft, rhythmic splashing coming from the direction of the lake. At first, she thought it might be a fish, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady, like someone wading through the water. She nudged Mark awake, and he groggily listened with her. The splashing continued, getting louder, closer. Probably an animal, Mark mumbled, turning over to go back to sleep. But Jenny wasn't convinced. She unzipped the tent as quietly as she could and peeked out, her heart pounding in her chest. The campfire had died down to embers, casting a dim glow over the campsite. The lake was just beyond the trees, and through the darkness, she could make out the faint outline of something moving in the water. Squinting, she strained her eyes, trying to get a better look. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw it, what appeared to be a figure, standing waist-deep in the lake, facing their campsite. It was too dark to make out any details, but the figure was clearly human, motionless, as if staring directly at her. A chill ran down Jenny's spine. She quickly ducked back into the tent and zipped it shut, her hands trembling. She shook Mark again, but he was already half asleep, dismissing her fears with a wave of his hand. Frustrated and scared, Jenny lay back down, her eyes wide open, listening intently. The splashing had stopped, and the forest had gone eerily silent. She didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, Jenny was the first one out of the tent. She immediately headed to the lake, her heart still pounding from the previous night's encounter. The water was calm, the surface reflecting the morning sky like a mirror. There was no sign of the figure she had seen, no footprints on the shore, nothing to suggest that anyone had been in the water. Feeling uneasy, she decided not to mention it to the others. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, or perhaps her tired mind had played a prank on her. But as the day went on, the memory of that dark figure lingered in the back of her mind. They spent the second day hiking through the woods surrounding the lake, exploring the dense forest and enjoying the untouched beauty of nature. But the sense of unease never left Jenny. She kept catching herself glancing back towards the lake, half expecting to see that figure standing in the water again. That night, as they gathered around the campfire, the wind picked up again, howling through the trees even louder than before. They tried to ignore it, focusing instead on telling ghost stories and trying to spook each other. But the wind seemed to have a mind of its own, growing stronger and more insistent, until it drowned out their voices. As they huddled closer to the fire, trying to keep warm, Jenny felt that same prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. She scanned the darkness around them, but saw nothing. The fire flickered and sputtered, casting eerie shadows that danced in the trees. Suddenly, there was a loud splash from the lake, followed by a strange, wet sloshing sound. The group fell silent, staring in the direction of the noise. The sound grew louder, coming towards them, and the fire suddenly went out, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in. Mark fumbled for the flashlight, but in his haste, he dropped it. The wet, sloshing noise was closer now, accompanied by a low, guttural moan that sent shivers down Jenny's spine. In the pitch blackness, Jenny grabbed Mark's arm, her heart pounding in her chest. The moaning grew louder, and she could hear the sound of something dragging itself across the ground, moving closer to their campsite. Finally, Mark managed to pick up the flashlight and flick it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on a figure standing at the edge of the lake. It was the same figure Jenny had seen the night before, but now it was closer, and she could see it clearly. The figure was a woman, her long, dark hair hanging in wet strands over her face. Her clothes were soaked, clinging to her thin frame, and her skin was an unnatural shade of pale, almost blue. But it was her eyes that terrified Jenny the most, wide, unblinking, and filled with an intense, unnatural rage. The woman stared at them, her mouth twisted into a snarl, water dripping from her body as she took a step forward. The sloshing sound echoed through the night as she dragged something heavy behind her, something that was half submerged in the water. David was the first to react. He grabbed Sarah's hand and bolted towards the car, yelling for everyone to follow. Jenny and Mark didn't need any more encouragement, they sprinted after them, adrenaline fueling their flight through the dark, unfamiliar terrain. They reached the car, fumbling with the keys in their panic. The woman's moaning grew louder, closer, and Jenny dared to look back. The figure was at the edge of the clearing now, still dragging whatever was in the water, leaving a trail of dark, thick liquid behind her. Finally, Mark managed to unlock the car, and they all piled in, slamming the doors shut. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the dirt road, leaving the lake and the terrifying figure behind. As they drove away, Jenny glanced out the rear window, half expecting to see the woman chasing after them. But the road was empty, the darkness swallowing the campsite and the lake behind them. They didn't stop driving until they reached the nearest town. Exhausted and shaken, they checked into a motel and spent the rest of the night in silence, too scared to talk about what they had seen. The next day, they agreed to pack up their campsite and leave Red Lake for good. But when they returned, they found that everything had been disturbed. The tents were slashed open, the contents scattered across the ground, and deep, muddy tracks led from the lake to where their campsite had been. But what shocked them most was the lake itself. Once clear and pristine, it was now a murky red, as if stained with blood. They didn't stay to investigate. They gathered what little they could salvage and left without looking back. Years later, Jenny still has nightmares about that weekend at Red Lake. She never found out who, or what, the woman was, or what she had been dragging out of the water. But one thing she knows for sure, she'll never go camping again. It was a sweltering summer afternoon when Samantha first stumbled upon the antique shop. Tucked away in a narrow alley, the small, nondescript storefront looked out of place among the modern boutiques and cafes that lined the main street. Its windows were clouded with dust, and the sign above the door had long since faded to an illegible blur. But something about the shop drew her in, like a whisper at the back of her mind urging her to explore. Pushing open the creaky door, Samantha was greeted by a musty smell that spoke of old, forgotten things. The shop was dimly lit, with rows of shelves crammed with all manner of oddities, rusted tools, cracked porcelain dolls, yellowed books, and faded paintings. It was a treasure trove for someone like Samantha, who had a deep love for anything old and mysterious. As she wandered through the narrow aisles, her fingers trailing over the dusty surfaces, she noticed something peculiar. Unlike other antique shops she had visited, there was no sense of organization here. Everything seemed haphazardly thrown together, as if the objects had been gathered with no rhyme or reason. Yet, despite the clutter, each item seemed to call out to her, drawing her into the shop. In the back corner, she found a small, ornate box sitting alone on a low shelf. The box was made of dark wood, inlaid with intricate silver patterns that gleamed even in the dim light. It was locked, but the key was missing. Something about the box fascinated her. She could almost feel a faint hum of energy emanating from it, like it was alive with some hidden power. Curious, Samantha picked up the box and brought it to the front counter, where an old man with thick glasses and a stooped back sat reading a newspaper. He looked up as she approached, his eyes narrowing behind the lenses. "Found something you like, miss?" he asked, his voice rough with age. Samantha nodded, placing the box on the counter. "How much for this?" The old man leaned forward, squinting at the box. His expression changed, a flicker of something dark crossing his features before he quickly replaced it with a practiced smile. "Ah, that old thing," he said, his tone now overly casual. "Are you sure you want it? It's just a trinket, really. Not worth much." "I'm sure," Samantha replied, feeling an inexplicable pull towards the box. "How much?" The old man hesitated for a moment before naming a price that was surprisingly low for something that seemed so valuable. Without a second thought, Samantha handed over the money, eager to take the box home and unlock its secrets. The old man wrapped the box in a piece of old cloth, his hands trembling slightly. As he handed it to her, he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Be careful with that, miss. Some things are better left locked away." Samantha brushed off his warning, too excited by her find to care. She thanked him and hurried out of the shop, clutching the box tightly to her chest. Back at her apartment, Samantha wasted no time in trying to open the box. She searched through her drawers for something that could serve as a makeshift key, but nothing seemed to work. Frustrated, she decided to set the box aside for the night, resolving to take it to a locksmith the next day. But as she tried to sleep, the box called to her. She could feel its presence on the nightstand, a strange, almost magnetic pull that kept her from drifting off. In the dead of night, unable to resist any longer, she got up and approached the box. To her surprise, the lock had somehow come undone. The lid now sat slightly ajar, as if beckoning her to open it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached out with trembling hands, lifting the lid ever so slowly. Inside the box, she found a collection of small, intricately carved wooden figures. Each figure was unique, depicting a person frozen in an expression of terror, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with horror. There were dozens of them, all arranged neatly within the confines of the box. Samantha stared at the figures, a sense of dread creeping over her. They were so detailed, so lifelike, it was as if the very essence of each person had been captured in the wood. As she examined them closer, she realized that each figure seemed familiar in some way, though she couldn't place why. The next few days were a blur. Samantha became obsessed with the figures, spending hours staring at them, trying to decipher their secrets. She began to notice strange things happening around her apartment, objects moving on their own, whispers in the night, shadows that shouldn't be there. The box, once merely a curiosity, now felt like a dark presence in her life, something that was slowly consuming her. One night, as she sat in front of the box, she noticed something horrifying. The newest figure in the collection looked exactly like her. It was a perfect miniature of herself, right down to the clothes she was wearing that very moment. The figure's expression was one of abject terror, its eyes wide with the same fear that was now gripping Samantha's heart. Panic set in as she realized the truth: these weren't just carved figures. They were people, trapped somehow within the wood, their souls imprisoned in the box. And now, the box had claimed her as well. Desperate, Samantha tried to destroy the box, but no matter what she did, burning, smashing, drowning, it remained intact, its sinister contents unscathed. Each attempt to rid herself of the box only made things worse. The whispers grew louder, the shadows more aggressive, until she could hardly sleep or think. In a last-ditch effort, she returned to the antique shop, hoping the old man could help her. But when she arrived, the shop was gone. The alley where it had stood was empty, as if it had never existed. Samantha was alone, with no one to turn to and nowhere to go. That night, as she sat in her dark apartment, clutching the box, she heard the familiar click of the lock. The lid opened on its own, revealing the tiny figure of herself, now placed prominently at the center of the collection. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself being drawn towards the box, her body growing numb. The last thing she saw before everything went black was her own terrified face, staring back at her from within the wood. When Samantha's friends reported her missing, the police searched her apartment but found no trace of her. The only clue was a small, ornate box sitting on her nightstand, locked tight, with no key in sight. The box found its way back to the antique shop, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble upon it. The old man behind the counter welcomed new customers with a warm smile, his collection growing ever larger with each passing year. The small, rural town of Willow Creek had always been a place where time seemed to stand still. Life moved at a slower pace, and the people who lived there were content with the quiet, uneventful nature of their lives. But there was one place in Willow Creek that the townsfolk avoided at all costs, the old well at the edge of the forest. The well had been there for as long as anyone could remember, its stone walls crumbling and covered in moss. It was said to be cursed, a place where bad things happened, a place where people disappeared. The townspeople had long since stopped using the well, opting instead to fetch water from the creek or from newer wells that had been dug closer to their homes. But despite the warnings, children were often drawn to the well, daring each other to get as close as they could without looking down into its dark depths. It was a rite of passage for many of the town's youth, a way to prove their bravery. And it was on one such dare that 14-year-old Jake found himself standing at the edge of the well, peering into the darkness below. Jake was the youngest of 3 brothers, always eager to prove that he was just as tough as they were. His brothers had all done the well challenge when they were his age, and now it was his turn. They stood behind him, taunting him, urging him to go further, to lean in just a little more. "Come on, Jake," his oldest brother, Sam, jeered. "Are you scared?" "Yeah, Jake," his other brother, Ben, chimed in. "Are you gonna chicken out?" Jake felt his heart race as he stepped closer to the edge, the cold stone rough under his fingertips. The air around the well was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic. He hesitated for a moment, the stories about the well flashing through his mind, but he pushed the fear aside. He wasn't going to let his brothers think he was scared. With a deep breath, Jake leaned over the edge and peered into the well. It was deeper than he had imagined, a seemingly endless pit of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. He could see nothing but the inky blackness below, hear nothing but the faint echo of his own breathing. "See? Nothing to be scared of," Jake called back to his brothers, trying to keep his voice steady. But just as he was about to step back, something caught his eye. A glint of light, far down in the darkness. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there, a tiny, flickering light that seemed to beckon him closer. Jake leaned in further, squinting to get a better look. The light seemed to pulse, growing brighter for a moment before dimming again. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. Without realizing it, Jake found himself leaning even further, his feet shifting dangerously close to the edge. "Jake, be careful." Sam called out, his voice suddenly laced with concern. But it was too late. Before Jake could react, the ground beneath his feet crumbled, and he slipped. He let out a scream as he tumbled into the well, his hands clawing at the air in a desperate attempt to catch hold of something, anything, to stop his fall. His brothers' shouts echoed above him, growing fainter as he fell deeper and deeper into the darkness. The walls of the well rushed past him in a blur, the light at the bottom growing brighter, larger, until it was all he could see. And then, with a sudden, bone-jarring impact, Jake hit the ground. For a moment, everything was silent. The air was thick and heavy, pressing down on him from all sides. Jake gasped for breath, his body aching from the fall. His vision was blurred, his head spinning, but he was alive. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Jake realized that he wasn't at the bottom of the well. He was in a tunnel, the stone walls slick with moisture. The light he had seen was coming from further down the tunnel, a pale, sickly glow that made his skin crawl. Jake staggered to his feet, wincing at the pain in his legs. The tunnel stretched out before him, the light at the end flickering like a dying candle. He didn't want to go towards it, but there was no other way out. With no other choice, Jake began to walk, each step echoing through the narrow space. The further he went, the stronger the smell became, that same metallic scent he had noticed earlier, now overpowering, like rusted iron. The light grew brighter, illuminating the walls around him. As Jake looked closer, he felt his stomach turn. The walls were covered in scratch marks, deep grooves carved into the stone as if something, or someone, had tried desperately to escape. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he quickened his pace, the fear rising in his throat. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, the light always just out of reach. He could hear something now, too, a faint, dripping sound, like water falling into a pool. When he finally reached the end of the tunnel, Jake found himself standing in a small, circular chamber. The light was coming from an old, rusted lantern that hung from a hook in the ceiling, its flame sputtering weakly. In the center of the chamber was a pool of dark, still water, and beside it, a pile of old, tattered clothes. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was looking at. The clothes were stained with dark patches, dried blood that had long since turned black. And there, next to the pile of clothes, was a small, carved figure, a crude, wooden doll with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. The dripping sound grew louder, more insistent, and Jake looked up to see that the water in the pool was rippling, disturbed by something below the surface. He stepped back, his eyes wide with terror as a shape began to rise from the water, a figure, pale and bloated, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. The figure's head lolled to the side as it emerged from the water, its empty eye sockets staring straight at Jake. Its mouth opened in a soundless scream, and the water around it turned red, as if it were bleeding from every pore. Jake turned and ran, his feet slipping on the wet stone as he raced back down the tunnel. The creature's rasping breaths echoed the lane, and growing louder, closer. He could feel its cold, clammy fingers brushing against his back, reaching for him. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't stop. He could see the wells opening above him now, a tiny circle of light far above. His brothers' voices were faint but still there, shouting his name. Jake reached the wall of the well and began to climb, his fingers finding purchase on the rough stone. He could feel the creature's breath on his neck, hear its guttural growls as it clawed its way up after him. With a final, desperate lunge, Jake grabbed hold of the edge of the well and pulled himself up, his brother's hands grabbing him and hauling him out of the darkness. He collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably. "Jake, are you okay?" Sam asked, his voice trembling with fear. Jake could only nod, his eyes wide with shock. He looked back at the well, expecting to see the creature emerging, but the darkness below was still, silent. They didn't stay to find out if it was still down there. Sam and Ben helped Jake to his feet, and they ran back to town as fast as they could, not stopping until they were safely home. Jake never told anyone what he saw in the well that day. The townspeople still talk about the old well, warning their children to stay away, but Jake knows that the stories are more than just tales to scare kids. He knows that something lives down there, in the dark, waiting for the next person foolish enough to peer into its depths. And sometimes, in the dead of night, Jake can still hear the sound of dripping water, and feel the cold, clammy breath of the creature on the back of his neck. Megan had always been a city girl, but when she inherited her grandmother's old house in the small town of Millfield, she saw it as a chance to start fresh. The house was big, much bigger than her cramped apartment, and it was surrounded by acres of forest. It was a perfect place to escape from the noise and chaos of city life. The townspeople were friendly, but Megan could sense that they were also a little odd. There was something about Millfield that felt different, like it was stuck in another time. People whispered to each other in the streets, and there were places in town they warned her to avoid, especially the old playground on the outskirts of the forest. The playground had been abandoned for years, they said. It was dangerous, a place where bad things happened. Megan shrugged off their warnings, figuring it was just small-town superstition. But curiosity gnawed at her, and one afternoon, she decided to check it out. The path to the playground was overgrown, barely visible through the thick underbrush. As Megan walked, the trees closed in around her, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, gradually faded away until there was only silence. When she finally reached the playground, Megan's breath caught in her throat. The place was eerily still, as if time had stopped. Rusted swings hung from chains, creaking gently in the breeze. A slide, once brightly painted, was now chipped and covered in moss. The merry-go-round was tilted to one side, its metal surface streaked with grime. But what struck Megan most was the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. She stepped cautiously onto the playground, the ground soft and spongy beneath her feet. A faint odor lingered in the air, something sour and metallic that made her nose wrinkle. She walked over to the swings, her fingers brushing against the cold metal chains. They felt wrong, slick and greasy, and she quickly pulled her hand away. As she turned to leave, something caught her eye, a flash of movement at the edge of the playground. She froze, her heart pounding, but when she looked closer, there was nothing there. Just the trees, standing silent and still. But then she saw it again, a shadow darting between the trees, too fast to be a trick of the light. Megan's heart raced, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to know what was out there. She took a step towards the trees, squinting into the shadows. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" There was no response, just the whisper of the wind through the leaves. But then, she heard it, a soft, childlike giggle, echoing from somewhere deep within the woods. Megan's blood ran cold. The giggle was playful, innocent, but there was something off about it. It sounded distant, distorted, as if it were coming from another time, another place. Against her better judgment, Megan followed the sound. She walked deeper into the forest, her feet crunching on the leaves, the giggle growing louder with each step. It seemed to dance around her, always just out of reach, leading her further and further from the playground. Finally, she reached a small clearing, and the giggle abruptly stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive, and Megan felt a shiver run down her spine. The clearing was empty, but in the center stood a single, small object, a teddy bear, worn and threadbare, its button eyes missing. Megan approached the bear cautiously, her heart thudding in her chest. As she bent down to pick it up, she noticed something strange about the ground beneath it. The earth was dark, almost black, and it gave off that same sour, metallic smell she had noticed earlier. Suddenly, the ground shifted. Megan stumbled back, her eyes widening in horror as she realized what she was standing on, a patch of earth that had been disturbed, dug up and then hastily covered. She was standing on a grave. Her mind raced, the pieces slowly falling into place. The playground, the warnings, the strange giggle, it all made sense now. This was no ordinary playground. It was a place of death, of something far darker than she had ever imagined. As she stood frozen in the clearing, the giggle returned, louder this time, and more sinister. It wasn't coming from the woods anymore. It was coming from beneath her, from the earth itself. Megan staggered back, her breath catching in her throat as the ground began to move, to shift and pulse as if something was trying to claw its way out. A hand shot up from the ground, pale and thin, its fingers curling around the teddy bear. Megan screamed, stumbling backward as more hands emerged, pulling themselves out of the earth, their skin stretched tight over bones, their eyes empty sockets that seemed to stare straight into her soul. The children were rising, their twisted, decomposed bodies climbing out of the shallow graves that had been hidden beneath the playground. Their mouths stretched into unnatural grins, revealing rows of jagged teeth, their giggles now echoing through the clearing, distorted and malevolent. Megan turned and ran, her legs pumping as fast as they could carry her, the sound of those twisted giggles chasing her through the woods. She could hear the rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches as the children pursued her, their laughter growing louder, more frenzied. She burst out of the woods and into the open air, her lungs burning, her heart ready to burst from her chest. The old house loomed in front of her, but it no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a tomb. Megan slammed the door behind her, bolting it shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The house was dark, the shadows long and deep, and she could feel the presence of the children outside, hear their whispers through the walls. She backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the room, searching for something, anything, that could protect her. But the house offered no sanctuary, no escape. The giggles were inside now, bouncing off the walls, coming from every direction. Megan's eyes fell on a mirror across the room, its surface fogged with dust. As she stared into it, she saw them, the children, standing right behind her, their eyes empty, their mouths twisted into those horrible grins. She screamed, spinning around, but the room was empty. The children were gone, but their presence lingered, heavy in the air. The mirror cracked, a jagged line splintering across its surface. Megan watched in horror as the crack spread, and then, as if in slow motion, the mirror shattered, sending shards of glass raining down onto the floor. In the broken pieces of glass, she saw them again, reflections of the children, their faces twisted with malice, their eyes locked onto hers. They were closer now, reaching out to her, their hands stretching through the broken glass, their fingers brushing against her skin. Megan tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her body was frozen, paralyzed by fear as the children's hands wrapped around her, pulling her into the mirror, into the darkness that lay beyond. And then, there was nothing but silence. When the townspeople found Megan's house the next day, it was empty. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of her anywhere. The only clue was a shattered mirror in the living room, its pieces scattered across the floor. But the townspeople knew what had happened. They knew the stories, the warnings that Megan had ignored. The playground was cursed, and it had claimed another victim. As the town went on with its quiet, uneventful life, the children's laughter could still be heard, faint and distant, echoing through the forest and around the forgotten playground. And somewhere in the darkness, Megan was with them, lost forever in the twisted, nightmarish world that lay beyond the mirror. When Emily and her parents moved to the quiet countryside, she was less than thrilled. Having grown up in the city, the idea of living in an old farmhouse surrounded by nothing but trees and fields was hardly appealing. But her parents were eager to start their new life, and she had little choice but to go along with it. The house itself was charming in an old-fashioned way, with creaky wooden floors, a wide porch, and a large attic filled with forgotten relics from the past. But it was the woods that surrounded the property that unsettled Emily. They were dense and dark, the kind of woods that seemed to swallow the light and muffle sound. There was something oppressive about them, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end whenever she looked out the window. The first few weeks in the new house were uneventful. Emily spent most of her time unpacking and exploring the dusty corners of the old farmhouse. She found a few interesting things in the attic, a collection of old photographs, a tarnished locket, a few yellowed letters, but nothing that held her attention for long. It wasn't until she discovered the journal that things began to change. Emily found it tucked away in the back of a closet, hidden beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets. The leather cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. Curious, she took it back to her room and began to read. The journal belonged to a girl named Margaret, who had lived in the house with her family many years ago. The early entries were filled with the usual musings of a young girl, descriptions of the house, the weather, and daily chores. But as Emily read on, the tone of the journal began to shift. The entries became more frantic, more fearful. Margaret wrote about the woods. How they seemed to watch her, how she felt eyes on her whenever she ventured too close. She wrote about strange noises in the night, whispers that seemed to come from the trees, and shadows that moved just beyond the edge of her vision. She wrote about a presence, something that moved in the darkness, always watching, always waiting. Emily shivered as she closed the journal, the weight of Margaret's fear settling over her like a heavy blanket. She couldn't shake the feeling that the journal had been meant for her to find, that Margaret was trying to warn her. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the journal, about the figure Margaret had seen. Her room felt colder than usual, the darkness heavier, and she found herself glancing towards the window more often than she wanted to admit. Just as she was starting to drift off, she heard it, a soft tapping at the window. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She told herself it was just a branch, just the wind, but the tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Gathering her courage, she slowly turned her head towards the window. At first, she saw nothing, just the dark outline of the trees beyond. But then, as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, tall and impossibly thin, with glowing eyes that burned through the night. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the figure took a step forward, then another. It moved with an unnatural grace, its limbs too long, too slender. As it drew closer, she could see its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where its face should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin, except for those eyes, those terrible, glowing eyes. The figure stopped at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. It tilted its head, as if studying her, and then it did something that made Emily's blood run cold. It raised a hand, long fingers tipped with sharp, black nails, and beckoned her. Emily was paralyzed with fear, her body refusing to move. The figure beckoned again, more insistently, its glowing eyes never leaving hers. And then, in that same low, guttural whisper she had read about in the journal, it called her name. Emily. The sound of her name snapped her out of her trance. She scrambled out of bed, her heart racing, and ran to her parents' room. She shook them awake, her voice trembling as she tried to explain what she had seen. Her father groggily followed her back to her room, but when they looked out the window, the figure was gone. The yard was empty, the woods dark and still. Her father tried to reassure her, saying it was just a bad dream, but Emily knew better. She had seen it, just like Margaret had. The next day, Emily tried to convince her parents to leave, to move back to the city, but they brushed off her fears as nothing more than nerves. They told her she would get used to the house, to the woods, that she would grow to love it here. But Emily knew she would never love this place. She could feel the figure's presence even in the daylight, lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for nightfall. It was watching her, just as it had watched Margaret all those years ago. That night, Emily didn't sleep. She sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the tree line, waiting. The hours dragged on, the darkness deepening, until finally, she saw it again, the figure, standing in the exact same spot as before, its glowing eyes locked onto hers. This time, it didn't beckon. It simply stared at her, its presence overwhelming, filling her with a deep, suffocating dread. Emily felt as if it was trying to pull her towards it, to drag her into the darkness of the woods where it waited. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from downstairs, followed by the sound of glass shattering. Emily's parents woke up in a panic, running downstairs to see what had happened. She followed them, her heart pounding, and found the living room window shattered, the curtains billowing in the wind. But there was no sign of an intruder, nothing to suggest what had broken the window. Her father chalked it up to a fallen branch, a freak accident, but Emily knew better. She could feel the figure's presence, closer now, just outside, waiting. Her parents insisted everything was fine, but they couldn't explain the deep scratches they found on the windowsill the next morning, or the strange symbols carved into the wooden frame. They couldn't explain the cold spots that began appearing in the house, or the whispers that echoed through the halls at night. Emily knew the figure was getting closer, that it was only a matter of time before it found a way in. She couldn't stay here, not another night. She packed a bag, intending to leave, to run as far away from this place as she could. But as she reached the door, she heard it again, a soft tapping at the window. Her blood ran cold as she turned slowly, her eyes drawn to the living room window. The figure was there, standing just outside, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. It was closer now, close enough that she could see the sharp, jagged teeth that lined its mouth, now twisted into a grotesque grin. "Emily." The whisper was louder now, more insistent. Emily felt a force tugging at her, pulling her towards the window, towards the figure that waited on the other side. She tried to resist, but her body was no longer her own. Her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her closer and closer to the window. As she reached out to open it, a voice cut through the fog in her mind, a voice that wasn't her own. It was Margaret. "Don't let it in," the voice whispered urgently. "Whatever you do, don't let it in." The spell was broken. Emily stumbled back, her hand dropping from the latch. She turned and ran, out of the house and into the night, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop running until she reached the town, where she collapsed on the doorstep of the local inn, sobbing and gasping for breath. The innkeeper, an elderly woman, took her in, her face grim as she listened to Emily's story. "You're not the first," the woman said, her voice tinged with sadness. "Others have seen it too, over the years. That's why no one lives in that house for long. The woods, they're cursed. Something lives there, something old and evil, and it's always looking for a way in." Emily knew she could never go back. She left the next morning, taking the first bus out of town and never looking back. The farmhouse was abandoned once again, left to decay in the shadow of the cursed woods. But the figure still waits there, watching, waiting for the next unlucky soul to venture too close. And in the dead of night, when the wind is just right, you can still hear it, soft tapping at the window, a low whisper on the breeze, calling out to anyone who will listen. When Lisa moved into her new apartment, she was thrilled. It was a charming place, located in an old building with high ceilings, vintage woodwork, and large windows that let in plenty of light. The previous tenant had left behind some furniture, which was a bonus since Lisa was just starting out and didn't have much of her own. Among the items was an antique mirror, tall and ornate, with a gilded frame that showed signs of wear but still held a certain elegance. The mirror stood in the corner of her bedroom, its surface slightly fogged with age. Lisa found it beautiful, if a bit unsettling. There was something about the way it reflected the room that felt off, but she dismissed it as her imagination. After all, the mirror was old, and old things often had a bit of character. It wasn't long before Lisa noticed strange things happening in the apartment. At first, it was small, easily explainable things, keys going missing, the feeling of being watched, shadows that seemed to move in the corner of her eye. She chalked it up to the stress of moving and adjusting to a new place. But the more time she spent in the apartment, the more unsettling the occurrences became. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Lisa decided to unwind with a hot bath. She filled the tub, lit a few candles, and sank into the warm water, letting the stress melt away. As she closed her eyes, she heard a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails lightly drumming against glass. She opened her eyes and glanced around the bathroom, but there was nothing there. The tapping continued, growing slightly louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the bedroom. Wrapped in a towel, Lisa stepped out of the tub and cautiously walked towards the sound. When she entered the bedroom, the tapping stopped abruptly. She looked around, her eyes landing on the mirror. It stood there silently, reflecting the room back at her, but something was different. The reflection felt wrong, like it was a fraction of a second out of sync with reality. She took a step closer, studying the mirror. For a moment, she thought she saw something move in the reflection, something that wasn't in the room with her. A shadow, dark and indistinct, seemed to flicker across the surface, but when she blinked, it was gone. Trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, Lisa convinced herself it was just the flickering candlelight playing tricks on her eyes. She went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, almost suffocating. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite control. The next day, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the mirror. She avoided looking directly at it, but every time she passed by, she felt a strange pull, as if something was drawing her in. She started to have nightmares, dark, twisted dreams where she was trapped in the mirror, unable to escape, with a shadowy figure always just behind her, whispering things she couldn't understand. One night, the nightmares became too much. Lisa woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding. She glanced at the mirror and froze. The reflection was wrong, completely wrong. The room in the mirror was dark, even though her bedroom light was on. The bed was empty, but she could see herself standing in front of the mirror, just like she was now. But the reflection of her didn't move in sync with her real body. It moved on its own. The reflection smiled, a cold, twisted grin that didn't belong on her face. Lisa gasped and stumbled back, her mind reeling with terror. The reflection in the mirror stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass as if trying to push through. Panicked, Lisa grabbed a blanket and threw it over the mirror, covering it completely. The moment the mirror was covered, the room felt lighter, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. But Lisa knew she couldn't live like this. The mirror was wrong, cursed even, and she needed to get rid of it. The next morning, Lisa called a local antique dealer, explaining that she wanted to sell the mirror. The dealer agreed to come by and take a look. When he arrived, he was an older man with sharp eyes and a serious demeanor. The moment he saw the mirror, his expression darkened. "This mirror, it's dangerous," he said, his voice low. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The dealer looked at her, his eyes grave. "This mirror is cursed. It's said to trap the souls of those who fall under its spell, keeping them imprisoned in the reflection. I've only heard stories, but seeing this mirror now, I believe them." Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. "Can you take it? Destroy it?" The dealer hesitated. "I can take it, but destroying it won't be easy. The curse is old, powerful. I'll have to find someone who knows how to break it." Desperate to be rid of the mirror, Lisa agreed, and the dealer carefully covered it with a heavy cloth before removing it from her apartment. As soon as the mirror was gone, the apartment felt lighter, the air easier to breathe. But the memory of the twisted reflection stayed with her, haunting her dreams. A week later, the dealer called her. His voice was strained, filled with an underlying fear. "I tried to have the mirror destroyed," he said. "But, it's gone. Gone." Lisa's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, gone?" "The mirror disappeared from my shop last night. I don't know how, but it's gone. Be careful, Lisa. Mirrors like that, they have a way of finding their way back to those who've fallen under their spell." Lisa hung up the phone, her hands trembling. She glanced around her apartment, every reflective surface now a potential threat. The dealer's words echoed in her mind, filling her with a deep, gnawing dread. That night, as she prepared for bed, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The blanket she had used to cover the mirror was back in her room, folded neatly on the bed. She hadn't brought it back, it had simply appeared there. Heart pounding, Lisa slowly turned to face the corner where the mirror had stood. It was empty, just an empty corner. But then, she noticed something else. The reflection in the window glass, a faint outline, barely visible, of a tall, ornate mirror standing in the corner of her room. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned back to the corner. It was still empty. But in the reflection, the mirror was there, and her twisted reflection was smiling back at her, the shadowy figure now standing right behind it. She knew she couldn't escape. The mirror had found its way back to her, and now, there was no getting rid of it. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was her reflection, stepping out of the glass and into her room, its smile widening as it reached for her. And then, silence. The next morning, when Lisa's friends came to check on her after she didn't answer their calls, they found her apartment empty. There was no sign of Lisa, no trace of her belongings. The only thing left was an old, ornate mirror standing in the corner of the room, its surface smooth and pristine, as if it had never been touched. And in the mirror's reflection, if you looked closely, you could see a figure, trapped behind the glass, screaming silently as it pounded against the surface, desperate to get out. But there was no escape. It started with the lullaby. Hannah had always been a light sleeper, the slightest sound waking her in the dead of night. But the soft, haunting melody that drifted through her new apartment seemed different. It was soothing at first, almost comforting. She assumed it was coming from a neighbor's apartment, maybe a mother singing her child to sleep. But as the nights went on, the lullaby persisted, growing louder, more insistent, and Hannah realized it was coming from within her own walls. Hannah had just moved into a small, old apartment on the outskirts of town. The building was ancient, with creaky floorboards and drafty windows, but it had character. The landlord had given her a good deal on the rent, too good to pass up, and she hadn't thought twice before signing the lease. The first night in the apartment was uneventful. Hannah spent the evening unpacking, arranging her furniture, and trying to make the place feel like home. It wasn't until she was lying in bed, just on the edge of sleep, that she heard it, a faint, lilting melody, carried on the breeze through the open window. It was soothing, a soft lullaby that seemed to wrap around her like a warm blanket, lulling her into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, Hannah barely remembered the lullaby, chalking it up to her imagination or a dream. She went about her day, exploring her new neighborhood and getting settled into her routine. But that night, the lullaby returned, clearer now, closer. It floated through the apartment, a gentle, hypnotic tune that seemed to seep into her very bones. Once again, Hannah fell asleep almost instantly, her dreams filled with soft music and shadowy figures that danced just out of reach. As the days passed, the lullaby became a nightly occurrence. Hannah would hear it as soon as she lay down, the melody weaving through her thoughts, soothing her, pulling her into sleep. She began to rely on it, looking forward to the moment when the music would start, signaling the end of the day and the beginning of her rest. But as comforting as the lullaby was, there was something unsettling about it. It never seemed to have a clear source, never grew louder or softer depending on where she was in the apartment. It was as if the melody was everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding her completely. One night, unable to shake the unease that had been building in her mind, Hannah decided to find the source of the lullaby. She stayed up late, waiting for the music to start. When it did, she began to search, moving from room to room, her heart pounding in her chest. But no matter where she went, the melody remained just as distant, just as elusive. It was like chasing a shadow, always out of reach. Frustrated and unnerved, she eventually gave up and went back to bed, where the lullaby quickly put her to sleep once again. The next morning, Hannah noticed something strange. The air in the apartment felt heavier, thicker somehow. The rooms were colder, and the light seemed dimmer, as if the sun was struggling to penetrate the gloom. She tried to brush off the feeling, telling herself it was just the weather, but the sense of unease lingered. That night, the lullaby returned, but it was different. The melody was slower, sadder, and there was a whispering beneath the music, soft but unmistakable. It was as if someone was speaking, their voice just out of earshot, hidden beneath the notes of the lullaby. Hannah strained to listen, her heart racing. The whispers were incoherent, a jumble of words and phrases that she couldn't quite make out. But there was a desperation in the voice, a pleading that sent chills down her spine. The lullaby continued, growing louder, more insistent. The whispers grew clearer, more distinct, and Hannah realized with a start that they were calling her name. Hannah. Hannah. She sat up in bed, her breath coming in short gasps. The lullaby was no longer soothing, it was oppressive, suffocating. The whispers were louder now, echoing through the apartment, filling every corner of her mind. Desperate to escape, Hannah jumped out of bed and ran to the door. But as she reached for the handle, the door slammed shut on its own, the force of it rattling the walls. She was trapped. Hannah, help us. The voice was clearer now, no longer a whisper but a desperate plea. Hannah turned slowly, her back pressed against the door, and saw something that made her blood run cold. Standing in the middle of the room was a figure, a young woman, pale and translucent, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. Her lips moved in time with the lullaby, singing the haunting melody that had lulled Hannah to sleep night after night. But it wasn't just one figure. As Hannah's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw them, dozens of figures, all standing silently in the room, their faces twisted with pain and fear. They were all women, all young, their bodies thin and frail, their clothes tattered and stained. Hannah, you have to help us, the young woman in front whispered, her voice trembling with fear. What do you want? Hannah stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's eyes filled with tears. We're trapped, we can't leave, the lullaby, it keeps us here. Hannah shook her head, her mind racing. How? How can I help you? Break the mirror, please, break the mirror. Hannah frowned, confused. What mirror? The woman pointed to the far corner of the room, where an old, ornate mirror stood against the wall. It was covered in dust and grime, its surface cracked and stained. Hannah hadn't noticed it before, it was as if it had appeared out of nowhere. Break it, the woman whispered again, her voice desperate. It's the only way to free us, the only way to stop the lullaby. Hannah hesitated, fear gnawing at her insides. But the pleading in the woman's eyes was too much to bear. With a shaky breath, she grabbed a heavy book from her nightstand and walked towards the mirror. The lullaby grew louder, more frantic, as if the mirror itself was fighting to protect it. The figures in the room began to cry, their voices joining the melody in a discordant chorus that echoed through Hannah's mind. Summoning all her strength, Hannah raised the book and brought it down on the mirror with a loud crash. The glass shattered, pieces flying in all directions, and the lullaby stopped abruptly. The apartment plunged into an eerie silence. The figures in the room began to fade, their sorrowful expressions slowly softening into relief. The young woman in front gave Hannah a grateful smile, her form growing fainter by the second. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible as she disappeared completely, leaving Hannah alone in the dark, silent room. The apartment felt different now, lighter, warmer. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, and the air felt easier to breathe. But Hannah knew she couldn't stay. The memories of the figures, the haunting lullaby, were too much to bear. She packed her things that very night and left the apartment, never looking back. The building was abandoned soon after, left to decay, its windows dark and empty. But some nights, when the wind is just right, you can still hear it, the soft, haunting melody of a lullaby, carried on the breeze, whispering through the empty halls of the forgotten building, calling out to anyone who will listen. And somewhere within those walls, the mirror waits, its surface cracked and broken, waiting for the next soul to fall under its spell. Sarah had always been a night owl. There was something about the quiet of the night that brought her peace, a stillness that she couldn't find during the day. She often stayed up late, curled up on the couch with a book or a movie, the rest of the world asleep while she reveled in her solitude. But that was before the calls started. It began one night around midnight. Sarah was lounging on the couch, halfway through a thriller novel, when her phone buzzed. The screen lit up, displaying an unknown number. At first, she hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her, and she answered. "Hello?" she said, her voice tentative. There was no response, only a faint crackling on the other end, like the sound of static. Sarah waited, her pulse quickening, but the line remained silent. After a moment, she hung up, assuming it was a wrong number. But the next night, it happened again. Another call, same unknown number, same eerie silence. This time, Sarah felt a prickle of unease. She waited for a few moments before speaking, hoping to catch the caller off guard. "Who is this?" she demanded, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Again, there was no response, just that same unsettling crackle of static. Sarah hung up, her heart pounding a little harder. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just a prank, but the silence on the other end of the line felt wrong, somehow. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from someone not speaking. It was a deeper, more unsettling void, like there was something, or someone, on the other end that wasn't entirely human. The calls continued every night, always at the same time, midnight. Sarah started to dread the hour, counting down the minutes with growing anxiety. She tried ignoring the calls, letting them go to voicemail, but they left no messages. The silence would follow her into her dreams, morphing into nightmares that left her waking in a cold sweat. As the days passed, the calls began to take a toll on her. She couldn't focus at work, her eyes constantly drifting to the clock as midnight approached. She became paranoid, jumping at every little noise, her nerves frayed and on edge. The once peaceful quiet of the night now felt oppressive, suffocating. One night, determined to put an end to the calls, Sarah decided to confront whoever, or whatever, was on the other end. She stayed up, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, waiting for the inevitable call. When the clock struck midnight, the phone buzzed, the unknown number flashing on the screen. With a deep breath, she answered. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady, though her hands were trembling. For a moment, there was the usual silence, the familiar crackle of static. But then, she heard something else, a faint whisper, just barely audible, as if it were coming from a great distance. "Sarah." Her blood ran cold. She hadn't told anyone about the calls, hadn't mentioned them to a soul. There was no way the caller could know her name. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, clearer this time, closer. "Sarah, let me in." A chill ran down her spine. She looked around her apartment, suddenly feeling vulnerable, exposed. The whisper continued, growing louder, more insistent. "Let me in, Sarah." Panicking, Sarah hung up the phone and turned off all the lights in the apartment. She locked the doors and windows, her heart racing, her mind racing with fear. She tried to calm herself down, telling herself it was just a prank, just someone messing with her. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The voice on the other end of the line wasn't human, it was something else, something dark and malevolent. And it knew her name. That night, she barely slept, every creak of the apartment sending her heart into overdrive. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, to shift, as if something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment to strike. The calls didn't stop. Every night, without fail, the phone would ring at midnight, the same unknown number, the same chilling whisper. "Sarah, let me in." She stopped answering the phone, but the calls continued, relentless. She tried blocking the number, but it didn't work. The calls would come from different numbers, always unknown, always at midnight. Desperate, Sarah reached out to the phone company, but they couldn't trace the calls. They assured her it was likely just a prank, but she could hear the doubt in their voices when she described the whispers. She even considered going to the police, but what could she tell them? That she was being harassed by a voice on the phone that might not even be human. The turning point came one night when she heard something new. After the usual whisper, there was a knock, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It was coming from her front door. "Sarah, let me in." She froze, her heart nearly stopping. The knocking continued, growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't just on the phone anymore, it was here, right outside her door. She grabbed a kitchen knife and tiptoed to the door, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. The knocking stopped as she approached, and for a moment, everything was silent. She hesitated, then looked through the peephole. There was nothing there, just the empty hallway, dimly lit by the flickering overhead light. But as she started to back away, she heard it again, this time from the window. Knock, knock, knock. Her blood ran cold. The window was on the 3rd floor, there was no way someone could be knocking on it. But the sound was unmistakable, deliberate, as if something was taunting her, playing with her fear. "Sarah, let me in." The voice was louder now, right in her ear, even though the phone was on the other side of the room. It was inside the apartment. Panicking, Sarah ran to the window and threw open the curtains. There was nothing there, just the dark night outside. But the knocking continued, louder, faster, now coming from all around her, doors, windows, walls. The whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, all chanting the same thing. "Let me in, let me in." She screamed, dropping the knife, clutching her head as the noise became unbearable. The lights flickered, the walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thick with an oppressive, suffocating presence. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The apartment was silent, the only sound the rapid beating of her heart. The lights stopped flickering, the air cleared, and the phone lay still on the floor, the screen dark. For a moment, Sarah dared to hope that it was over, that whatever it was had finally left her alone. But then, slowly, she turned to face the living room window. And there, on the other side of the glass, she saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, with pale, translucent skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to suck the light out of the room. Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, and its long, bony fingers tapped against the glass, keeping a slow, deliberate rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. It was waiting for her. Sarah backed away, her legs shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure's grin widened, and it raised a hand, pressing its palm against the glass. And then, in a voice that was low and guttural, it spoke. "Let me in." Sarah turned and ran, her mind consumed with terror. She grabbed her keys and fled the apartment, not stopping until she was outside, standing in the cold night air. She didn't look back, didn't dare to, as she raced to her car and drove away, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She never returned to the apartment. She couldn't. The mere thought of it filled her with a bone-deep dread that she knew she would never shake. She left everything behind, her belongings, her life, starting over in a new city, far away from the midnight calls, the knocking, the whispers. But even now, in the quiet moments of the night, she can still hear it. The faintest echo of a knock, the whisper of her name carried on the breeze. "Sarah, let me in." She knows it's still out there, waiting, searching for her. And one day, she fears, it will find her again. Isabella had always been fascinated by dolls. As a child, she had an extensive collection, each one carefully arranged on the shelves of her bedroom. Her favorite was a delicate porcelain doll, dressed in a frilly pink gown with soft ringlets of golden hair and glassy blue eyes that seemed to follow her every move. But as she grew older, her love for dolls waned, and the collection was eventually packed away, left to gather dust in the attic of her parents' home. Years later, when Isabella inherited her grandmother's old house, she found herself drawn back to that childhood fascination. The house was a grand, old Victorian manor, filled with antique furniture, dusty portraits, and relics of a bygone era. But what caught Isabella's attention most was the small room at the end of a narrow hallway, locked tight with a rusty key she found hidden in her grandmother's jewelry box. When she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she discovered what could only be described as a dollmaker's workshop. The room was filled with shelves of doll parts, porcelain heads, tiny hands and feet, glass eyes in every shade imaginable. On the workbench lay several half-finished dolls, their faces eerily lifelike despite their incomplete state. The room had a strange, musty smell, a mix of dust and something else she couldn't quite place, something that made her skin crawl. In the center of the room stood a single, completed doll. It was different from the others, more elaborate, more alive. The doll was dressed in a Victorian-era gown, its hair a cascade of jet-black curls, its eyes a deep, unsettling green. Its expression was serene, yet there was something in those eyes that sent a shiver down Isabella's spine. There was a small plaque at the base of the stand where the doll was displayed. It read, "Clara, 1895. Isabella felt a strange connection to the doll, an inexplicable urge to take it with her. She carefully lifted Clara from her stand and carried her down to the parlor, placing her on a shelf where she could admire her. But from the moment Clara entered the main part of the house, strange things began to happen. One night, as she was drifting off to sleep, Isabella was jolted awake by the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there, a soft, sibilant voice, speaking words she couldn't quite understand. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the parlor. Heart pounding, she got out of bed and slowly made her way down the dark hallway, her footsteps barely making a sound on the old wooden floor. The whispering grew louder as she approached the parlor, the words becoming clearer, though still too garbled to comprehend. She pushed open the door and flicked on the light, but the room was empty. Everything was as it should be, except for Clara. The doll, which she had left on the shelf, was now sitting in the center of the room, her green eyes staring directly at Isabella. The air in the room was thick with tension, and the whispering had stopped the moment the light had come on. A chill ran down Isabella's spine as she approached the doll. She reached out to pick it up, but as soon as her fingers touched the porcelain skin, she recoiled in horror. The doll's body was cold, unnaturally so, like it had been sitting in a freezer. And its expression, once serene, had twisted into a malevolent smirk. Panicking, Isabella grabbed Clara and threw her into a box, shoving it into a closet at the back of the house. She locked the door and tried to push the unsettling experience out of her mind. But the house would not let her forget. Over the next few days, the disturbances escalated. The footsteps became louder, more insistent, and the whispers turned into clear, taunting voices. Objects in the house began to move on their own, books falling from shelves, doors slamming shut without warning. The air grew colder, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. One night, after a particularly terrifying encounter where she saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed, Isabella decided she needed answers. She returned to the dollmaker's workshop, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. Among the old papers and notebooks scattered across the workbench, she found a journal. It belonged to her grandmother, who had apparently been the dollmaker. The entries started off normal enough, detailing her work on various dolls and the pride she took in her craft. But as Isabella read further, the tone of the journal became darker and more frantic. Her grandmother wrote about a special project, a doll unlike any other, one that she intended to imbue with a life of its own. She had been inspired by old, forbidden texts that spoke of ancient rituals and dark magic. The process required a human soul, one that could be bound to the doll, giving it sentience and a life of its own. The final entry in the journal was the most disturbing. Her grandmother had written that the ritual had been a success, but at a terrible cost. The doll, Clara, had come to life, but it was no longer a simple plaything. It was something else, something evil. Her grandmother had tried to contain the doll, to lock it away, but Clara's influence had grown too strong. Isabella's hands shook as she read the final, scrawled line in the journal, "She wants out." Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the parlor. Isabella dropped the journal and ran to the source of the noise, her heart hammering in her chest. When she entered the room, she found the closet door where she had locked Clara wide open. The box was overturned, and the doll was gone. She searched the house frantically, but Clara was nowhere to be found. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, now louder and more menacing. They seemed to come from every direction, echoing through the empty rooms, filling Isabella with a sense of dread so deep she could barely breathe. And then, she heard the footsteps, soft, deliberate, and coming from the stairs. Isabella's breath caught in her throat as she turned towards the sound. Standing at the top of the stairs, silhouetted by the dim light filtering through the window, was Clara. The doll's eyes gleamed with a malevolent light, and its mouth was twisted into that same horrific smirk. Clara began to move, her tiny feet stepping down the stairs with an unnatural grace. Each step echoed through the house, slow and deliberate, as if she was savoring every moment. Isabella backed away, her mind racing with terror. She knew she had to get out of the house, but her legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot by the overwhelming fear that gripped her. "Isabella," the voice was no longer a whisper, it was clear, cold, and filled with malice. Clara's voice. "Isabella, play with me." The words sent a wave of panic through her. She turned and ran, not daring to look back. The doll's footsteps quickened behind her, now a rapid patter as it chased her through the house. She burst through the front door and into the night, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold air hit her like a wall, but she didn't stop running until she was far away from the house, the sound of Clara's footsteps finally fading into the distance. Isabella never returned to the house. She left everything behind, unable to face the horror that she had unwittingly unleashed. The house was eventually abandoned, left to decay, its windows dark and empty. But the townspeople knew better than to go near it. They whispered of the old dollmaker's house, of the cursed doll that still roamed its halls, waiting for someone to play with. And on quiet nights, when the wind was just right, you could hear it, the soft, rhythmic patter of tiny footsteps, and the cold, clear voice of Clara, calling out to anyone who would listen. "Isabella, play with me." The small town of Ashwood had always been quiet, nestled deep in the woods far from the hustle and bustle of the city. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where secrets were hard to keep, and where life moved at a slower pace. But there was one part of Ashwood that everyone avoided, a desolate stretch of road that wound through the dense forest, known to the locals as Scream Hollow. The road had a dark history, one that the townspeople rarely spoke about. It was said that years ago, a horrific accident had occurred there. A school bus carrying a group of children had swerved off the road and plunged into the ravine below. The bus had caught fire on impact, and the screams of the children trapped inside echoed through the woods for hours before they were finally silenced. Since that day, Scream Hollow had been shunned, a place of darkness and death. The road was rarely used, and those who did dare to drive through it at night often reported hearing strange noises, faint whispers, eerie laughter, and, most disturbingly, the distant sound of screams. For years, the stories had been nothing more than local legend, a way to keep curious teenagers from venturing too far into the woods. But for Emily, the stories were about to become all too real. Emily was a college student, home for the summer after a particularly grueling semester. She had grown up in Ashwood, but had never put much stock in the town's ghost stories. She was more of a skeptic, someone who believed in the tangible and the explainable. So when her friend Mike dared her to drive through Scream Hollow one night, she accepted without hesitation. It was a warm, moonlit night when Emily and Mike set out on their little adventure. They drove in Mike's old, beat-up car, the headlights cutting through the darkness as they left the safety of the town and entered the woods. The road quickly narrowed, the trees closing in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy that blotted out the sky. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Mike asked, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Emily smirked, her eyes focused on the road ahead. "Come on, Mike, it's just a road. Nothing's going to happen." Mike nodded, though he didn't look convinced. The stories of Scream Hollow had always unnerved him, but he didn't want to back down in front of Emily. So he sat back in his seat, trying to relax as they drove deeper into the woods. The road twisted and turned, the trees growing thicker and more oppressive with each passing mile. The air inside the car grew heavy, almost stifling, and the only sound was the steady hum of the engine. But then, something changed. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that both Emily and Mike shivered. A thick fog began to creep in, swirling around the car, obscuring the road ahead. Emily slowed down, her confidence waning as the fog thickened, reducing visibility to just a few feet. "This is weird," she muttered, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Mike didn't respond. He was staring out the window, his eyes wide with fear. The fog outside seemed to move on its own, shifting and swirling as if something was lurking within it. And then they heard it, the faint sound of children laughing, echoing through the fog. Emily and Mike exchanged a glance, both of them hearing it at the same time. The laughter was distant, almost playful, but there was something off about it, something that sent chills down Emily's spine. "Do you hear that?" Mike whispered, his voice trembling. "Yeah," Emily replied, her voice tight. "But it's probably just the wind." The laughter grew louder, more distinct, and soon it was joined by another sound, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all around them. Emily's heart began to race as she strained to hear what the whisper was saying, but the words were garbled, incomprehensible. Suddenly, the car's radio crackled to life, the static loud and jarring in the silence. The dials spun on their own, flipping through stations that were nothing but white noise and faint, distorted voices. Emily and Mike stared at the radio, their fear mounting as the static grew louder, almost deafening. And then, over the static, they heard it, the sound of screams. It started low, almost a moan, but quickly grew in intensity, until it filled the car with the horrifying cries of children in pain. The sound was so real, so visceral, that it felt as if the screams were coming from inside the car. Emily slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. The fog outside the windows thickened, pressing against the glass like a living thing. The screams grew louder, more frantic, and the whispers intensified, becoming clearer, more insistent. "Help us. Let us out. We're burning." The voices overlapped, a cacophony of terror that filled the car, drowning out everything else. Emily clutched the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Mike was shaking beside her, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth moving but no sound coming out. The temperature in the car dropped even further, their breath visible in the air. The windows began to frost over, the cold seeping into their bones. And then, out of the corner of her eye, Emily saw movement in the rearview mirror. At first, it was just a shadow, dark and indistinct, but as she stared, the shape began to take form. A small figure, no more than a child, stood in the back seat, its eyes glowing with a pale, ghostly light. Its face was twisted in a grotesque mask of pain and fear, its mouth open in a silent scream. Emily gasped, her heart lurching in her chest. She whipped around to look in the back seat, but there was nothing there, just the empty, fog-filled darkness. But when she turned back to the mirror, the figure was closer, its hand reaching out towards her, its eyes filled with an unnatural, malevolent hunger. "Emily," the voice in the car whispered, the sound sending ice through her veins. She screamed, slamming her foot on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, tires spinning on the slick, fog-covered road. The screams and whispers intensified, filling the car with a deafening roar as they sped down the narrow road. The fog thickened, the world outside disappearing entirely, and the car shook violently as if something was trying to force its way inside. Emily gripped the wheel, her vision blurring with tears of fear and desperation. Suddenly, the fog cleared, and the car burst out of the woods, skidding to a stop in the middle of the main road. The radio fell silent, the cold air dissipated, and the oppressive weight that had filled the car lifted. Emily and Mike sat in stunned silence, the only sound their lack of radio. The road ahead was empty, the town of Ashwood visible in the distance, its lights twinkling like stars. Without a word, Emily threw the car into gear and drove back to town, her hands still shaking, her mind reeling from what had just happened. Mike was silent beside her, his face pale, his eyes wide with lingering terror. They never spoke of what they had experienced in Scream Hollow. It was as if the words themselves would give power to the horrors they had witnessed, bring them back into the light. But neither of them could forget the sound of those screams, the whispers of the lost children who still haunted the hollow, trapped in their eternal torment. The road through Scream Hollow remains empty to this day, shunned by the townspeople and avoided by travelers. And on dark, foggy nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear it, the faint, distant sound of children laughing, followed by the echo of their screams. But those who are wise know better than to listen too closely, for the hollow has a way of drawing you in, of making you part of its twisted history. And once you hear the screams, there's no escaping their call. It was an old house, the kind with creaky floorboards and drafty windows that seemed to whisper in the dead of night. Situated on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town, the house had a reputation for being cursed, though no one could quite say why. The locals avoided it, passing by with their heads down, quickening their pace as they walked by. It was the kind of place that invited rumors and speculation, but few had the courage to investigate. When Daniel inherited the house from his estranged uncle, he saw it as an opportunity. He was a writer, always on the lookout for inspiration, and what better place to find it than in a mysterious, possibly haunted mansion. He packed up his belongings, left the city behind, and moved into the old house, eager to start his next novel. The house was everything he had hoped for, large, imposing, and filled with hidden nooks and crannies. The rooms were dark and dusty, filled with antique furniture and relics from a bygone era. It was the perfect setting for a horror story, and Daniel could feel the ideas swirling in his mind, just waiting to be put to paper. But there was one thing about the house that unnerved him. In the basement, hidden behind a heavy curtain, was a door. It was unlike any other door in the house, black, made of a wood so dark it seemed to absorb the light. The door had no handle, no keyhole, nothing to indicate that it could be opened. It was simply there, a solid, immovable presence that sent chills down Daniel's spine every time he looked at it. At first, Daniel tried to ignore the door. He focused on setting up his writing space, exploring the rest of the house, and getting settled into his new life. But the door lingered in the back of his mind, an itch he couldn't quite scratch. It was always there, always watching, as if it were waiting for him to make the first move. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel's curiosity grew. He began to spend more time in the basement, standing in front of the black door, his fingers tracing the smooth, cold wood. He wondered what lay behind it, another room, a hidden passage, perhaps. Or something darker, something that had been locked away for a reason. The more he thought about it, the more obsessed he became. He tried to pry the door open, but it wouldn't budge. He searched the house for a key, for any clue as to how the door might be opened, but found nothing. The door remained a mystery, an enigma that gnawed at him day and night. And then, one evening, Daniel heard it, the faintest sound, coming from behind the door. It was barely audible, just a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of fingers drumming on wood. He pressed his ear against the door, straining to hear, and the tapping grew louder, more insistent. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. The tapping stopped. Daniel's heart raced as he waited for a response, but there was only silence. He stepped back, his mind reeling. Had he imagined it? Or was there really something behind the door, something that was aware of him? That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The tapping echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the door that refused to leave him alone. He tossed and turned, his thoughts consumed by the possibility of what might lie on the other side. The next morning, he made up his mind. He had to know what was behind the door, no matter the cost. He grabbed a crowbar from the garage and headed down to the basement, determination driving him forward. He stood in front of the door, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The room felt colder than usual, the air thick with tension. He hesitated for a moment, the crowbar heavy in his hands, but then he took a deep breath and jammed the metal tool into the crack between the door and the frame. With a grunt, he heaved against the crowbar, his muscles straining as he tried to force the door open. At first, it resisted, but then, with a loud, splintering crack, the door gave way, swinging open with a rush of cold air that sent shivers down Daniel's spine. He stepped back, the crowbar slipping from his grasp, and stared into the darkness beyond the door. The room on the other side was pitch black, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sour. Daniel grabbed a flashlight from a nearby shelf and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The room was small, the walls lined with stone, and in the center of the floor was a set of narrow stairs leading down into the earth. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the stairs, the flashlight trembling in his hand. He had come this far, there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, he descended the stairs, the darkness closing in around him as he went deeper and deeper into the earth. The stairs seemed to go on forever, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. The smell grew stronger, the metallic tang filling his nostrils and making his stomach turn. But he pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity. Finally, he reached the bottom of the stairs and found himself in a small, circular chamber. The walls were lined with symbols, strange, ancient markings that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. In the center of the room was a stone altar, and lying on the altar was a figure. It was a woman, her body pale and emaciated, her hair a tangled mess of dark strands. Her eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths. Daniel's heart skipped a beat as he realized she was alive, but barely. He approached the altar, his flashlight flickering as he drew closer. The woman's eyes suddenly snapped open, and Daniel stumbled back in shock. Her eyes were black, completely devoid of color, and they locked onto his with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a rasping, hollow sound that seemed to echo in the chamber. Daniel hesitated, his mind racing. Who was this woman? How had she ended up here, locked away behind the black door? And why did her presence fill him with such an overwhelming sense of dread? Before he could respond, the woman's body began to convulse, her limbs twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and the symbols on the walls flared to life, glowing with a sickly, green light. The room trembled, the walls seeming to close in on him as the air filled with a low, droning hum. Daniel stumbled back, his flashlight flickering and then going out completely, plunging the chamber into darkness. He turned and ran, the stairs seeming to stretch on forever as he scrambled to escape. The woman's screams echoed in his mind, a haunting, inhuman sound that sent waves of terror crashing over him. He could feel something behind him, something dark and malevolent, chasing him up the stairs, clawing at his heels. Finally, he burst out of the chamber and into the basement, slamming the black door shut behind him. He stood there, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest, the darkness pressing in around him. But the door wouldn't stay shut. It began to creak open, slowly, as if something on the other side was pushing against it. Daniel grabbed the crowbar and wedged it against the door, his hands shaking as he tried to keep it closed. For a moment, the door held, the pressure on the other side growing stronger and stronger. But then, with a final, bone-chilling creak, the door was forced open, and a cold, inky darkness poured out, engulfing the room. Daniel screamed as the darkness swallowed him whole, his body freezing as the cold seeped into his bones. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the sound of that low, droning hum, and the woman's voice, whispering in his ear. "Help me." The house was found empty a few days later, the front door left wide open, and Daniel was never seen again. The locals whispered about the curse of the black door, about the darkness that had finally claimed another victim. The house still stands on the outskirts of town, shunned and forgotten, the black door hidden away in the basement, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to open it. And those who dare to pass by at night swear they can hear it, the low hum, the faint whispers, and the sound of a man's voice, crying out for help from behind the black door. But no one ever comes to his aid. Elena had always been drawn to the peculiar and the strange, so when she stumbled upon the old, abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town, she couldn't resist exploring it. The house had been vacant for years, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. The townspeople whispered about it, claiming it was cursed, but no one could remember exactly why. Elena, however, saw it as an adventure, a chance to uncover the secrets that had been hidden away for so long. One crisp autumn afternoon, she made her way to the mansion, her curiosity piqued by the stories she had heard. The iron gate at the front of the property was rusted and hanging off its hinges, creaking as she pushed it open. The driveway was cracked and overgrown with weeds, leading up to the imposing double doors of the house. Elena hesitated for a moment, the eerie silence around her pressing down like a weight, but her sense of adventure won out, and she walked up to the front door. To her surprise, the door wasn't locked. It creaked open with a groan, revealing a grand entryway bathed in the dim light that filtered through the grimy windows. Dust motes danced in the air, and the smell of age and neglect filled her nostrils. The interior was as grand as the exterior, with sweeping staircases, ornate chandeliers, and faded wallpaper that hinted at the mansion's former glory. Elena stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under her weight. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and she wrapped her arms around herself as she looked around. There was something off about the house, something that made her skin prickle, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She wandered through the house, exploring the decaying rooms, each one filled with relics of the past, dusty furniture, cracked mirrors, and old portraits whose subjects seemed to watch her as she passed by. But it wasn't until she reached the ballroom that she realized what was truly strange about the mansion. The ballroom was massive, with a high ceiling and tall windows that were covered with heavy, moth-eaten drapes. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces cloudy with age, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. But what caught Elena's attention were the masks. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, were mounted on the walls, each one more elaborate and grotesque than the last. They were made of all sorts of materials, porcelain, wood, metal, and even what looked like bone. The masks depicted a wide range of expressions, from joy and sorrow to fear and rage. Some were beautiful, intricately decorated with jewels and feathers, while others were twisted, almost monstrous in their design. Elena was fascinated. She had never seen anything like it. Who had made these masks? And why had they been left behind in this decaying mansion? She approached the nearest mask, a delicate porcelain one with a serene, almost angelic expression. It was so lifelike, so perfect, that she couldn't resist reaching out to touch it. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, a shiver ran down her spine, and the room seemed to grow colder. Ignoring the feeling, she moved on to the next mask, and the next, each one more captivating than the last. But as she continued her inspection, she began to notice something disturbing. The expressions on the masks seemed to change when she wasn't looking. The serene faces twisted into grimaces of pain, the joyful ones contorted with fear. And when she looked away, they seemed to revert back to their original state, as if nothing had changed. Elena's unease grew, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. There was something about the masks that drew her in, that made her want to understand their secrets. She continued her exploration, moving deeper into the ballroom, until she reached the far end of the room. There, in the center of the wall, was a mask unlike any other. It was larger, more elaborate, and it seemed to pulse with a dark energy that made Elena's skin crawl. The mask was made of blackened wood, its surface cracked and worn, but its expression was the most haunting of all. It was a mask of a face twisted in agony, its mouth open in a silent scream, its eyes wide with terror. Elena stared at the mask, unable to look away. She felt a strange pull, as if the mask was calling to her, beckoning her to come closer. She took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached out to touch the mask, the room seemed to shift around her. The air grew thick, and the shadows deepened, swallowing the corners of the room in darkness. The mirrors on the walls flickered with movement, and Elena could see shapes, figures, moving within them, figures wearing the very masks that hung on the walls. The mask before her began to glow with a faint, eerie light, and Elena's hand trembled as she hesitated, her fingers inches away from the cursed object. But she couldn't stop herself. She had to know. The moment her fingers made contact with the mask, a wave of darkness washed over her, and she felt herself being pulled into the mask, into the screaming face. The world around her spun, and she fell to her knees, clutching her head as a chorus of voices filled her mind, screams, cries, and whispers, all overlapping in a cacophony of despair. And then, just as suddenly, the noise stopped. Elena opened her eyes, and she was no longer in the ballroom. She was standing in a grand hall, filled with people dressed in opulent clothing, their faces hidden behind elaborate masks. The room was alive with music and laughter, but something was wrong. The laughter was too loud, too forced, and the eyes behind the masks were filled with fear. Elena tried to move, to speak, but she couldn't. She was frozen in place, her body no longer her own. She felt a presence beside her, and when she turned her head, she saw the black mask, hovering in the air, its empty eyes locked onto hers. "You should not have touched the mask," a voice whispered in her ear, cold and hollow. "Now you are one of us." Elena's heart raced as the figures around her began to turn, their masked faces slowly shifting to face her. The music grew louder, more frantic, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. She wanted to scream, to run, but she was trapped. The figures closed in around her, their eyes empty and soulless, their masks twisted in expressions of pain and fear. And then, one by one, they began to remove their masks. Beneath the masks, their faces were gone, only darkness remained, a void where their features should have been. The darkness spread, creeping up the walls, across the floor, until it consumed everything in its path. Elena felt herself being pulled into the void, the darkness wrapping around her like a shroud. The last thing she saw was the black mask, its mouth twisted into that same, agonized scream, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. And then, there was nothing. When Elena's friends went looking for her the next day, they found the mansion empty, the ballroom filled with nothing but dust and decay. But the masks were still there, hanging on the walls, their expressions as lifelike as ever. And among them, there was a new mask, one with a face twisted in fear, its mouth open in a silent scream, its eyes wide with terror. The mansion remains abandoned to this day, its doors locked and its windows boarded up. But those who dare to enter and gaze upon the masks say they can hear it, the sound of muffled screams, trapped within the faces that stare back at them from the walls. And if you look closely, you might just see one of the masks change, its expression shifting to match the fear in your own heart. But by then, it's too late. The House of Masks has claimed another soul. The small village of Oakridge was nestled deep in the countryside, surrounded on all sides by a dense forest that stretched for miles. The villagers had lived in harmony with the woods for generations, relying on the trees for timber and the streams for water. But there was one part of the forest that everyone avoided, the Whispering Woods. The Whispering Woods were an ancient, tangled part of the forest where the trees grew tall and twisted, their branches interlocking to form a dark canopy that blocked out the sun. The air in the woods was always cool, damp, and heavy with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. The villagers spoke of strange sounds that emanated from the heart of the woods, whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves, or from something hidden deep within the shadows. No one knew what caused the whispers, but the stories passed down through the generations warned of an ancient curse. It was said that those who ventured too deep into the woods would hear the whispers calling to them, luring them further into the darkness until they were lost forever. The villagers respected the boundaries of the woods, never venturing beyond the well-trodden paths that skirted the edges of the whispering woods. But that was before the drought. The summer had been unusually dry, and the village's crops were failing. The streams that normally flowed from the forest were reduced to trickles, and the villagers began to worry that they wouldn't have enough food to last the winter. Desperation set in, and talk turned to the possibility of venturing deeper into the forest in search of water and game. Nathan was a young man, strong and determined, who had always been fascinated by the legends of the Whispering Woods. He had heard the stories all his life, but he had never believed in curses or superstitions. So when the village council decided to send a group of hunters into the forest to search for resources, Nathan volunteered without hesitation. The older villagers warned him of the dangers, but Nathan was undeterred. He gathered his gear, along with 3 other young men from the village, and they set off early one morning, determined to find whatever the village needed. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew cooler, the trees taller and more twisted. The sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The sounds of the village faded away, replaced by the eerie silence of the woods. Nathan and his companions pressed on, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves and moss underfoot. The deeper they went, the more uneasy they became. There was a sense of being watched, a feeling that the forest itself was aware of their presence. By midday, they had found no sign of water or game. Frustration began to set in, and the group decided to take a break. They sat down in a small clearing, the only spot where a faint beam of sunlight managed to break through the canopy. The air was thick and still, and the silence was oppressive. As they rested, Nathan began to notice something strange. The forest wasn't entirely silent, there was a faint sound, just on the edge of hearing, like the rustling of leaves or the soft murmur of a distant stream. But the more he listened, the more he realized that the sound wasn't natural. It was rhythmic, almost like a voice, whispering in the distance. "Do you hear that?" Nathan asked, breaking the silence. The others looked at him, frowning. "Hear what?" one of them asked. Nathan strained his ears, trying to focus on the sound. It was clearer now, a soft, rhythmic whisper that seemed to come from all around them. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, insistent, as if calling to him. "It's the whispers," Nathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The ones they talk about in the village." The others exchanged uneasy glances, and one of them stood up. "We should head back," he said, his voice tight with fear. "We've gone far enough." But Nathan was already on his feet, his curiosity piqued. "Wait," he said, his eyes scanning the dense woods around them. "I want to see where it's coming from." "Are you crazy?" one of the others hissed. "You know the stories. If you go after the whispers, you'll never come back." But Nathan wasn't listening. The whispers were growing louder, clearer, and he felt an irresistible urge to follow them. It was as if the forest itself was calling to him, pulling him deeper into its heart. Without another word, Nathan plunged into the trees, leaving his companions behind. The whispers seemed to guide him, leading him through the tangled underbrush, past ancient, gnarled trees, and into the deepest part of the forest. The further he went, the darker it became. The trees grew so close together that they blocked out the sky, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with a jumble of words and phrases that he couldn't quite understand. But he kept going, driven by a force he couldn't explain. Finally, he reached a clearing deep within the heart of the Whispering Woods. In the center of the clearing stood a massive, ancient tree, its trunk twisted and blackened with age. The ground around it was barren, the earth cracked and dry, as if life itself had been drained from it. Nathan approached the tree, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers were louder now, echoing through his mind, drowning out all other thoughts. He reached out and placed his hand on the tree's rough bark, and the whispers stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. The air was still, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, the ground beneath him began to shift. The roots of the tree twisted and writhed, breaking through the earth and wrapping around his legs, pulling him down. Nathan tried to scream, but no sound came out. The roots tightened around him, dragging him towards the base of the tree. As he struggled, the whispers returned, louder and more frantic, filling his mind with a torrent of voices. He realized, with a growing sense of horror, that the whispers weren't coming from the trees, they were coming from the earth itself, the souls of those who had been consumed by the forest long ago. The roots tightened, pulling him closer to the tree. The bark split open, revealing a gaping maw, dark and endless, and the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. Nathan's vision blurred, his strength fading as the forest claimed him. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the twisted face of the tree, its hollow eyes staring down at him, and he knew, in that moment, that the stories were true. The Whispering Woods were cursive, and once they had you, they never let go. When Nathan's companions returned to the village, they were empty-handed and shaken. They told the villagers what had happened, but no one dared to go after them. They knew better than to venture into the heart of the Whispering Woods. The drought eventually ended, and the village's streams began to flow again. But the villagers never forgot the young man who had been lost to the woods. They spoke of him in hushed tones, warning others never to follow the whispers, no matter how tempting they might be. And on quiet nights, when the wind was just right, the villagers claimed they could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, coming from deep within the forest. They said the whispers were calling for someone new, waiting for the next soul to venture too far into the woods. But no one ever went to find out. The Whispering Woods remained silent, dark, and deadly, a place where the trees held their secrets close, and the whispers of the lost were carried on the wind. Samantha had always been fascinated by art, particularly old paintings with a mysterious history. So, when she found an antique shop tucked away in a narrow alley on the outskirts of town, she couldn't resist stepping inside. The shop was dimly lit, filled with dusty relics of the past, furniture, jewelry, trinkets, and, of course, paintings. It was a treasure trove for someone like her. As she wandered through the shop, her eyes fell on a large, ornate frame propped up against the wall in the back corner. The painting inside the frame was covered by a dusty sheet, but something about it called to her. She hesitated for a moment, then carefully pulled the sheet away. The portrait beneath was striking. It depicted a young woman with dark, flowing hair and piercing green eyes. She was dressed in a flowing gown of deep red, standing in front of a large, arched window that looked out onto a stormy night. The detail in the painting was incredible, the brushstrokes so fine that the woman seemed almost lifelike, as if she might step out of the frame at any moment. But what truly captivated Samantha were the woman's eyes. They seemed to follow her as she moved, filled with a sadness and intensity that made Samantha's heart ache. The more she looked at the painting, the more she felt drawn to it, as if the woman in the portrait was reaching out to her, trying to tell her something. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a thin frame and sharp eyes, appeared at her side, startling her from her reverie. "You found something special, I see," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Samantha nodded, unable to tear her eyes away from the portrait. "Who is she?" The shopkeeper hesitated for a moment, his gaze lingering on the painting. "No one knows for sure," he said finally. The painting was found in an old, abandoned manor, hidden away in the attic. Some say she was the lady of the house, but there are rumors, dark rumors. Samantha raised an eyebrow. What kind of rumors? The shopkeeper leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. They say she was cursed. That she made a deal with something unnatural. And when she tried to break the deal, she was trapped inside the painting, doomed to watch the world from within the frame for all eternity. A shiver ran down Samantha's spine, but she shook it off. Sounds like a good ghost story, she said with a nervous laugh. But it's just a painting, right? The shopkeeper smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Take it, if you wish. But be careful. Some things are best left undisturbed. Despite the eerie warning, Samantha couldn't resist. She bought the painting and took it home, hanging it in her living room where she could admire it every day. The woman's eyes continued to follow her, filled with that same haunting sadness, but Samantha convinced herself it was just a trick of the artist's skill. For the first few days, nothing unusual happened. Samantha would often find herself standing in front of the painting, lost in thought as she stared into those piercing green eyes. But soon, strange things began to occur. It started with the dreams. Every night, Samantha found herself dreaming of the woman in the portrait. In the dreams, the woman was always standing in front of the window, gazing out into the stormy night, her expression one of deep sorrow. Samantha could hear the wind howling and the rain lashing against the glass, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something terrible was about to happen. But no matter how hard she tried, Samantha couldn't get the woman to turn away from the window, couldn't get her to speak or explain what was wrong. The dreams were always the same, and each morning, Samantha woke up feeling more and more exhausted, the weight of the dreams pressing down on her. Then, things began to escalate. One evening, as Samantha was sitting in her living room, she noticed something strange. The storm outside seemed to mirror the one in the painting, dark clouds gathering, the wind picking up, and thunder rumbling in the distance. But it wasn't just a coincidence. The storm in the painting seemed to move, the clouds swirling and the rain beginning to fall, just as it did outside her window. Startled, Samantha blinked and rubbed her eyes, but the movement in the painting continued. The woman in the portrait seemed more lifelike than ever, her eyes filled with desperation as she stared out of the frame, silently pleading with Samantha. A chill ran down her spine, and she quickly turned away, trying to convince herself that it was just her imagination. But as the night wore on, the sense of unease grew. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling louder, the rain pounding against the windows. And in the painting, the woman's expression grew more and more anguished, as if she knew something terrible was about to happen. That night, the dreams were worse than ever. The woman was no longer standing by the window, she was reaching out to Samantha, her hand pressing against the glass as if trying to escape. Samantha could hear her voice now, faint and distorted, whispering words she couldn't understand, but the desperation in the woman's eyes was unmistakable. When Samantha woke the next morning, she was drenched in sweat, her heart racing. She knew she couldn't keep the painting in her home any longer. It was affecting her, invading her dreams, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was trying to tell her something she didn't want to hear. Determined to get rid of the painting, Samantha took it down and carried it to the basement, intending to store it away until she could figure out what to do with it. But as she descended the stairs, the lights flickered, and she felt a sudden, intense coldness in the air. She placed the painting against the wall and turned to leave, but the basement door slammed shut behind her with a loud bang. The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as she fumbled for the light switch, her heart pounding in her chest. But the lights wouldn't come back on, and the room remained pitch black. And then, she heard it, a faint whisper, coming from the direction of the painting. "Help me." Samantha froze, her blood running cold. The voice was faint, distant, but she knew it was the woman from the portrait. "Please, help me." The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and Samantha felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. She knew she should leave, should get out of the basement and never look back, but she couldn't move. The voice held her in place, rooted to the spot. Slowly, she turned to face the painting. In the darkness, the woman's eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural light, and her expression was one of pure, unbridled terror. "Help me," the voice pleaded, and Samantha could see the woman's hand pressing against the inside of the frame, as if trying to break free. Without thinking, Samantha reached out to touch the painting, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold surface. The moment she made contact, the room was flooded with light, and a blinding pain shot through her hand, up her arm, and into her chest. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the storm raging outside. The painting seemed to pulse with energy, the woman's face twisting in agony as the pain intensified. Samantha tried to pull away, but she was trapped, her hand glued to the canvas, her body racked with pain. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the woman's eyes, filled with a deep, consuming darkness, and she knew, in that moment, that the woman had found her escape. When Samantha's friends came looking for her, they found the house empty, the front door wide open, and the storm raging outside. The only sign of her was the portrait, now hanging back on the wall in the living room. But the portrait had changed. The woman's expression was no longer one of sadness or desperation. It was a smile, a cold, cruel smile, and her eyes were Samantha's. The painting remained in the house, untouched, its new owner trapped within the frame, just as the previous one had been. The storm eventually passed, and the house fell silent once more. But those who visited the house in the years that followed claimed they could still hear it, the faint sound of a woman's voice, pleading for help, coming from within the portrait. And the eyes, those green eyes would follow them as they moved, watching, waiting, and always, always smiling. Jared had always been drawn to the strange and unexplained, so when he heard about the abandoned hotel just outside of town, he knew he had to investigate. The Crescent Hotel, as it was called, had once been a grand and luxurious place, the jewel of the area, but it had been closed for decades after a series of mysterious disappearances. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning people to stay away, but that only fueled Jared's curiosity. It was said that the hotel had been cursed, that those who stayed there were never heard from again. Some claimed to have seen lights in the windows late at night, even though the hotel had long since fallen into disrepair. Others spoke of hearing strange noises, whispers, footsteps, and even screams, emanating from within its walls. Undeterred by the warnings, Jared decided to spend a night in the Crescent Hotel. He was a freelance journalist, always on the lookout for a good story, and the hotel seemed like the perfect subject for his next article. He packed a bag with the essentials, a flashlight, camera, notebook, and a few snacks, and set off one late afternoon. The drive to the hotel was uneventful, the road winding through dense forests that seemed to close in around him as he neared his destination. The sun was beginning to set when he finally reached the old building, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. The windows were dark, the paint peeling from the walls, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Jared parked his car at the edge of the overgrown driveway and made his way to the front entrance. The massive double doors were slightly ajar, creaking as he pushed them open. He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and the smell of mildew hit him like a wave. Dust hung in the air, and the only light came from the fading sun filtering through the grimy windows. The lobby was eerily silent, the once opulent furnishings now covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. A grand staircase led to the upper floors, its red carpet faded and threadbare. The chandelier that hung from the ceiling was missing several crystals, swaying slightly as if disturbed by an unseen breeze. He decided to explore the rest of the hotel, starting with the upper floors. The staircase creaked loudly as he ascended, and the air grew colder the higher he went. By the time he reached the second floor, the temperature had dropped significantly, and his breath was visible in the dim light. The hallway stretched out before him, long and narrow, with doors on either side. The carpet was worn and faded, and the walls were lined with old, framed photographs of the hotel in its heyday. Jared paused to examine one of the photos, squinting at the smiling faces of the guests who had once stayed there. They looked so happy, so full of life, but something about the photo made him uneasy. As he moved down the hallway, he noticed that the doors were all slightly ajar, just like the front entrance. He peered into the first room he came to, shining his flashlight inside. The room was small, with a single bed, a dresser, and a nightstand. Everything was covered in dust, and the bedspread was torn and moth-eaten. He continued down the hallway, checking each room as he went. They were all the same, empty, decaying, and silent. But the further he went, the more he began to feel that the silence wasn't natural. It was oppressive, almost as if the hotel itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Halfway down the hall, Jared stopped in his tracks. He had heard something, just a faint sound, barely audible over the silence. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of footsteps echoing from somewhere deep within the hotel. He stood still, straining to listen, but the sound had stopped. His heart began to pound in his chest as he realized he wasn't alone. But when he turned around, the hallway was empty, just as it had been before. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing through the empty corridor. There was no response, only the suffocating silence. Jared's instincts told him to leave, to get out of the hotel before something went terribly wrong, but his curiosity won out. He continued down the hall, the flashlight beam flickering as he moved. The tapping sound started again, louder this time, coming from somewhere above him. He reached the end of the hallway, where a narrow staircase led to the third floor. The air was even colder here, the walls lined with frost that glittered in the dim light. The tapping continued, now joined by a faint, whispering sound, like voices carried on the wind. Jared hesitated, fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. But he couldn't turn back now. He had come this far, and he needed to know what was making those sounds. He took a deep breath and started up the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The third floor was even darker than the others, the windows boarded up and the air thick with dust. The hallway here was shorter, with only a few doors on either side. The tapping had stopped, but the whispering continued, growing louder as he approached the far end of the hall. He reached the last door on the left, the whispers now so loud that they drowned out his thoughts. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, half expecting it to be locked. But the door swung open easily, revealing a large, luxurious suite that was in much better condition than the rest of the hotel. The room was richly furnished, with a large canopy bed, a fireplace, and an ornate rug that covered the floor. The air here was warmer, the scent of roses lingering in the air. But what caught Jared's attention was the figure standing by the window. It was a woman, her back to him, dressed in a long, flowing gown. Her dark hair cascaded down her back in loose waves, and she was staring out the window at the night sky. The whispers seemed to emanate from her, filling the room with their eerie chorus. Jared's breath caught in his throat as he stepped into the room. "Excuse me," he said, his voice shaky. "Who are you?" The woman didn't respond. She remained motionless, her gaze fixed on the window. Jared took another step closer, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. He could feel the temperature dropping again, the warmth of the room leaching away as the air grew thick with an oppressive, suffocating energy. He reached out to touch her shoulder, but the moment his fingers brushed the fabric of her gown, she turned to face him. Jared stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The woman's face was pale, her eyes hollow and empty, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, only the sound of the whispers, now deafening, filling Jared's mind with a torrent of voices, each one more desperate than the last. He tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't move. The woman stepped closer, her empty eyes locking onto his, and the whispers grew into a roar, drowning out everything else. Jared's vision blurred, his mind consumed by the voices, each one pleading, screaming, begging for help. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. Jared blinked, his head spinning as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. The woman was gone, the room empty, and the whispers had faded into silence once more. He turned and ran, not caring about the story, not caring about anything except getting out of the hotel. He raced down the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls, the cold air biting at his skin. He didn't stop until he burst through the front doors and into the night, gasping for breath. The hotel loomed behind him, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. But Jared knew better. He had felt the presence in that room, had heard the voices of those who had been trapped within its walls. He didn't look back as he got into his car and sped away, leaving the Crescent Hotel behind. But the memory of the woman's hollow eyes and the sound of the whispers would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Crescent Hotel remains abandoned, its halls silent and empty, but those who dare to venture near say they can still hear it, the faint sound of footsteps, the soft murmur of voices, and, if you listen closely, the desperate whispers of the souls trapped within its walls. And on nights when the wind howls through the trees, the hotel seems to come alive, the whispers carrying on the breeze, searching for the next person to answer their call. But once you hear the whispers, there's no escaping them. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of struggling in the city, Lila finally found a small house she could afford in a quiet, rural town. It was a modest place, nestled at the edge of a sprawling field, with a thick forest just beyond. The town was welcoming, the people friendly, and Lila quickly settled into her new life. But from the moment she moved in, Lila felt like something was off. The house was old, with creaky floors and drafty windows, but it was more than that. It was the silence, the kind of deep, oppressive silence that made her feel like she was being watched. At first, she chalked it up to nerves, to the stress of moving and being alone in a new place. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. It started with the shadows. At night, when Lila sat in her living room reading or watching TV, she would catch movement out of the corner of her eye. Just a flicker, a shadow passing by, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. The house would be empty, still, the only light coming from the flickering glow of the TV. At first, she tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just her imagination. But the shadows became more frequent, more distinct. They weren't just flickers anymore, they were shapes, human-like figures that seemed to move just beyond the edge of her vision. And they were getting closer. One night, as she lay in bed, Lila heard a soft rustling noise, like something brushing against the walls. She sat up, her heart pounding, and strained to listen. The noise was faint, but it was there, coming from beneath the floorboards. She froze, her mind racing. The house didn't have a basement, just a crawl space beneath the floor. The thought of something moving down there, just below her bed, made her skin crawl. The rustling continued, growing louder, more insistent. Lila grabbed her phone, using the flashlight to scan the room, but there was nothing there. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift and writhe as the light passed over them, but she couldn't see anything that could be making the noise. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she lay awake, clutching her phone, listening to the rustling beneath her floor until it finally stopped just before dawn. The next morning, she decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight, put on some old clothes, and went outside to the small hatch that led to the crawl space under the house. It hadn't been opened in years, the hinges rusty and the wood swollen from years of exposure to the elements. With some effort, she pried the hatch open and shone the flashlight into the dark space below. The air was musty, filled with the smell of damp earth and rotting wood. The space was cramped, barely tall enough to crawl through, with old pipes and wires snaking across the dirt floor. Lila hesitated, a sense of dread settling in her stomach. But she had to know what was causing the noise, what was making her feel so uneasy in her own home. She lowered herself into the crawl space, her heart pounding in her chest. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but dirt and dust at first. But as she crawled further in, she noticed something strange. The ground was uneven, like something had disturbed the earth, leaving behind small mounds and depressions. And then she saw it, a small, dark hole in the ground, barely wider than a fist. It looked like it had been dug recently, the edges sharp and clean. She shone the flashlight into the hole, but it was too deep to see the bottom. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the hole wasn't empty. Something was moving inside it, just at the edge of the light. She leaned closer, trying to get a better look, when suddenly, something shot out of the hole, brushing past her face. Lila screamed, scrambling backward, her heart hammering in her chest. The flashlight fell from her hand, the beam dancing wildly across the dirt as she tried to get away from whatever had come out of the hole. She crawled back to the hatch, her hands shaking, and pulled herself out of the crawl space. She slammed the hatch shut and ran back into the house, locking the door behind her. She stood there for a moment, gasping for breath, her mind racing. Whatever was in that hole, she didn't want to know. She couldn't stay in the house any longer. She grabbed her keys and her phone, planning to drive to the nearest hotel and figure out what to do in the morning. But as she turned to leave, she froze. The shadows on the walls had shifted again, but this time, they weren't just flickering shapes. They were solid, human-like figures, standing in the corners of the room, their dark forms towering over her. Lila's breath caught in her throat as the figures began to move, gliding toward her silently, their shadowy limbs stretching out as they reached for her. She backed away, her mind screaming for her to run, but her legs felt like lead. The shadows closed in, surrounding her, their forms shifting and writhing as they drew closer. The air grew cold, and she felt a sharp, icy pain in her chest as one of the shadows reached out and touched her. It was like nothing she had ever felt before, like the warmth was being drained from her body, leaving behind only a deep, bone-chilling cold. Lila gasped, her vision blurring as the shadows pressed in around her, suffocating her, pulling her down. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the dark, shadowy form looming over her, its hollow eyes staring into her soul. When Lila's friends came to check on her the next day, they found the house empty, the front door standing wide open. Her car was still in the driveway, but there was no sign of her anywhere. The only clue was the crawl space hatch, which was found pried open and left ajar. Inside, they found the flashlight, lying on the dirt floor, its beam still shining faintly. But there was no sign of Lila, only the small, dark hole in the ground, now covered in fresh earth. The house was eventually sold to another family, but they didn't stay long. They complained of strange noises at night, of shadows moving in the corners of their vision, and of a deep, oppressive cold that seemed to settle over the house as soon as the sun went down. The house remains empty now, shunned by the townspeople, who speak of it only in whispers. They say the shadows beneath the house are still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too close. And sometimes, on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can hear it, the faint rustling of something moving beneath the floorboards, the soft whispers of the shadows as they wait in the dark. But by then, it's too late. The shadows have already found you. It was late one night when Jake found himself alone on the platform of a small, remote train station. He had missed his connection and was stranded in a town he'd never heard of, with no way to get home until morning. The station was old and worn, its wooden benches splintered and a single, flickering light casting long shadows across the cracked concrete floor. The wind howled through the empty platform, carrying with it the distant sound of a train whistle. Jake checked his watch, just past midnight. He knew there weren't supposed to be any more trains tonight, but the sound of the whistle was unmistakable, growing louder as it approached. Curiosity piqued, Jake stepped closer to the edge of the platform, peering down the dark tracks. In the distance, he could see the faint glow of a headlight cutting through the fog, and soon enough, an old, rusted train emerged from the darkness, slowing as it neared the station. The train was like something out of another time. Its carriages were worn and battered, the paint peeling and the windows clouded with age. The wheels screeched as it came to a stop, and the doors slid open with a loud, metallic groan. Jake hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. There was something wrong about this train, something that sent a shiver down his spine. But as he looked around the deserted station, the thought of spending the night alone on the cold platform seemed even less appealing. Taking a deep breath, Jake stepped onto the train. The air inside was stale and musty, filled with the scent of old leather and dust. The interior was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows across the worn seats and cracked walls. He walked down the narrow aisle, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence. The train seemed empty, the seats vacant, and the only sound was the faint hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the old metal frame. Jake chose a seat near the back, where he could see the entire carriage. He set his bag on the floor and settled in, the worn seat creaking beneath him. He glanced around, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. The train lurched forward with a sudden jolt, and Jake was thrown back against the seat. The lights flickered once more before stabilizing, and the train began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed as it left the station behind. Jake stared out the window, watching as the dark countryside sped by in a blur. The fog outside was thick, obscuring everything beyond the glass, and the only thing he could see was the reflection of the dimly lit carriage. As the train hurtled through the night, Jake's eyelids grew heavy, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels lulling him into a daze. But just as he was about to drift off, he heard something, a soft, distant whisper. He sat up, his heart skipping a beat. The whisper was faint, almost indiscernible, but it was there, coming from somewhere further down the carriage. He strained his ears, trying to make out the words, but they were too garbled, too faint to understand. Jake stood up, his pulse quickening. He looked down the aisle, but the carriage was still empty. The whisper continued, growing louder, more urgent, as if it was calling to him, beckoning him to come closer. Against his better judgment, Jake began to walk down the aisle, his footsteps slow and hesitant. The whisper grew louder with each step, filling the carriage with a low, eerie murmur. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the walls, resonating in his mind. He reached the end of the carriage and stopped in front of the door that led to the next one. The whisper was louder now, almost a chant, the words still unintelligible but filled with an urgency that sent chills down his spine. Jake hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to return to his seat and wait for the train to reach the next station. But something compelled him to move forward, to find the source of the whispering. With a deep breath, he opened the door and stepped into the next carriage. The air was colder here, the lights dimmer, and the whispers louder, almost deafening. The carriage was filled with shadowy figures, seated in every row, their heads bowed as they muttered in unison. Jake's heart raced as he realized the figures were people, passengers, just like him. But there was something wrong with them. Their skin was pale and waxy, their eyes sunken and hollow, and their lips moved soundlessly, as if they were whispering something only they could hear. He backed away, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figures didn't react to him, they remained in their seats, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. The sound filled his mind, drowning out all other thoughts, until he could barely think. Suddenly, the train jolted, and Jake was thrown against the wall. The lights flickered, and the whispering stopped abruptly, plunging the carriage into an eerie silence. The shadowy figures were gone, the seats empty once more, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. Jake scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He had to get off the train, had to escape whatever nightmare he had stumbled into. He turned and ran back to the door, but when he opened it, he found himself standing in the same carriage, the same empty seats stretching out before him. Panic set in as he realized the train was trapping him, leading him in circles, keeping him from escaping. The whispers began again, louder this time, as if they were coming from directly inside his head. Jake stumbled down the aisle, desperate to find a way out. The train seemed to stretch on forever, the carriages identical, the doors leading him back to where he started. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with their maddening chant. He reached the last carriage and stopped in his tracks. At the end of the aisle, where the door should have been, was a solid wall of darkness, impenetrable and all-consuming. The whispers reached a crescendo, the voices blending into a single, terrible scream that echoed through the carriage. Jake clutched his head, his vision blurring as the darkness closed in around him. The walls of the train seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the air thick with the stench of decay and rot. The shadowy figures reappeared, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their mouths open in a silent scream. He fell to his knees, the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, crushing him. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the twisted, grinning faces of the shadowy figures, their eyes gleaming with a sinister light. When Jake didn't show up for work the next day, his co-workers assumed he had simply overslept. But when days passed with no word from him, they began to worry. The police were called, and a search was conducted, but Jake was never found. His car was discovered at the small, remote train station, covered in a thin layer of frost, as if it had been sitting there for days. The station was deserted, the platform empty, and there was no sign of the mysterious train that Jake had boarded. The Crescent Line, as it was known, had been out of service for decades, the tracks long since abandoned. But every so often, on foggy nights when the moon is hidden behind the clouds, locals claim to hear the distant sound of a train whistle, followed by the eerie rumble of wheels on the tracks. Those who listen closely might even hear it, the faint, desperate whisper of a voice calling out from the darkness, lost forever on the midnight train. But once you hear the whisper, it's already too late. The train has found you, and there's no escape from the shadows that dwell within. As the time approached, Rachel's excitement mingled with a growing sense of unease. The room felt colder, the shadows in the corners darker and more menacing. But she pushed the fear aside, focusing on the ritual. At exactly 3:33 a.m., she lit the candle and began to chant the incantation written in the book. The words felt strange on her tongue, foreign and ancient, but she spoke them with conviction, her voice growing stronger with each repetition. The flame of the candle flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, swirling around her in a dance of darkness. The air grew heavy, charged with an unnatural energy, and Rachel felt a pressure building in her chest, as if the room itself was closing in on her. She finished the incantation, her voice trembling with both fear and excitement. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was silent, the only sound the rapid beating of her heart. But then, the candle flame sputtered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Rachel gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the mirror. In the dim light, she could just make out her own reflection, but something was wrong. Her reflection was smiling, a cold, sinister grin that didn't match the fear on her own face. She stumbled back, her mind racing. The room felt wrong, distorted, as if the walls were shifting and closing in around her. The shadows that had been swirling around her began to take shape, forming dark, humanoid figures that loomed in the corners of the room. Rachel tried to speak, to move, but her body refused to obey. The shadows crept closer, their forms solidifying into grotesque, twisted versions of humans, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. They surrounded her, their mouths moving soundlessly as they whispered in a language she couldn't understand. The mirror in front of her rippled, as if the glass were made of water. Her reflection was gone, replaced by a dark void that seemed to stretch on forever. From within that void, something emerged, a figure, tall and shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing with the same eerie light as the shadows around her. The figure stepped out of the mirror, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Rachel felt her knees buckle as it loomed over her, its face hidden in shadow. The room was filled with the sound of whispers, growing louder and louder until they merged into a single, terrible voice. "You have opened the door," the voice said, each word reverberating through her mind. "And now, you must pay the price." Rachel tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, its hand brushing against her skin, and she felt a coldness seep into her very soul, draining her of warmth, of life. The shadows closed in around her, their whispers turning into a cacophony of voices, all chanting the same word, mine. The darkness consumed her, and Rachel felt herself being pulled into the void, into the endless abyss that lay beyond the mirror. The last thing she saw was the figure's eyes, glowing with a terrible, ancient power, as the world around her faded into nothingness. When the sun rose the next morning, the house was empty. The candles had burned out, the chalk circle smudged, and the mirror stood in the center of the room, its surface smooth and undisturbed. There was no sign of Rachel, no trace of the ritual she had performed. The book she had found was never seen again, and the house was left untouched, eventually falling into disrepair. But those who passed by at night claimed they could hear it, the faint sound of whispers, carried on the wind, and the soft, mournful cry of a woman lost to the darkness. And on the rare nights when the clock struck 3:33 a.m., the witching hour at its peak, some said they could see her face in the mirror, trapped forever in the void, her eyes pleading for a release that would never come. But the door had been opened, and there was no turning back. The shadows had claimed her, and the witching hour was theirs. The small, secluded town of Ravenwood had always been cut off from the rest of the world. Nestled deep in the mountains, it was a place where time seemed to stand still. There were no cell towers, no internet, and the only way in or out was a single winding road that was often impassable during the winter. The residents didn't mind, they preferred the quiet, the isolation. But that isolation was shattered one cold October night when the radio station began its last broadcast. Ravenwood had a single radio station, WVRW, broadcasting on 103.5 FM. It was a relic from the past, run by a man named Henry Gorman, who had been the station's only DJ for as long as anyone could remember. Henry was a fixture of the town, his deep, comforting voice a constant presence in the lives of the residents. He played old records, shared local news, and occasionally told ghost stories late at night, when the winds howled through the mountains. But on that night, the broadcast was different. It started like any other evening. The sun had set, and the streets of Ravenwood were quiet. Families were sitting down to dinner, and the warm glow of lamps filled the windows of the old houses. The radio in the corner of each living room played the familiar sound of Henry's voice as he introduced the next song. But then, the music cut off abruptly. There was a moment of silence, and then Henry's voice came back on the air, but it was different. There was a tremor in his voice, a note of fear that no one had ever heard before. "Good evening, Ravenwood," he said, his voice wavering. "I don't know how to say this, but something is very wrong." The town fell silent as everyone tuned in, their attention drawn to the strange tone in Henry's voice. He wasn't reading from his usual script. This wasn't part of the show. "I've been getting reports," Henry continued, his voice shaking. "Strange noises, voices on the wind, and shadows. Shadows that move on their own." There was a pause, and the sound of shuffling papers could be heard over the air. Henry took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "If anyone is listening, please, stay inside. Lock your doors, close your windows, and don't go outside. Whatever it is, it's not safe." A wave of unease swept through the town. The residents exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to make of the broadcast. Henry was known for his ghost stories, but this felt different, too real, too urgent. As the minutes passed, the tension in the air grew thicker. The radio continued to play, but now it was filled with static, interrupted occasionally by snippets of Henry's voice, muttering something unintelligible. The static seemed to pulse, growing louder and softer in an unnatural rhythm, as if the station itself was struggling to stay on the air. Then, the broadcast changed again. "Are you still there?" Henry's voice crackled through the static, barely audible. It's here. It's in the station." The words sent a chill down the spines of everyone listening. Henry's voice was filled with terror, something no one in the town had ever heard before. It was raw, desperate. "I don't know what it is," he continued, his voice breaking. "But it's watching me. It's in the shadows. I can see it, moving closer. Please, if anyone can hear me, don't let it take me." There was a loud crash, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. The static grew louder, drowning out Henry's voice, and then there was silence. For a moment, the radio was dead air, no sound, no static, nothing. The people of Ravenwood held their breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. Then, the silence was broken by a sound that no one in the town would ever forget. It was a scream, long, piercing, and filled with a terror so profound that it shook everyone who heard it to their core. The scream echoed through the town, coming through the radios in every house, every car, every business. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the scream stopped, and the broadcast cut out completely. The town was plunged into silence. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind outside, howling through the trees. Hours passed, but the radio never came back on. The familiar sound of Henry's voice was gone, replaced by an unsettling quiet that seemed to hang over the town like a shroud. The next morning, a group of men from the town decided to investigate the station. They found the building locked, the windows dark. When they finally forced their way inside, they discovered the studio in disarray. The records were scattered across the floor, the microphone was smashed, and the walls were covered in deep scratches, as if something had clawed its way through. But Henry was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere in the building, or in the surrounding woods. It was as if he had simply vanished. The radio station never broadcast again. The building was boarded up, left to decay as the years passed. The people of Ravenwood tried to move on, but the memory of that night lingered, a dark shadow over the town. To this day, no one knows what happened to Henry Gorman or what he saw in that studio. Some say it was a prank, others believe it was something more, a dark force that had been waiting, biding its time, until the witching hour came, and the veil between worlds was thin enough to cross. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the mountains and the moon is hidden behind the clouds, the people of Ravenwood say you can still hear it, the faint sound of static, the echo of a terrified voice, and the distant, bone-chilling scream of a man lost to the darkness. But once you hear the last broadcast, there's no turning back. The shadows have found you, and the witching hour is upon you.